All right. So let's see. We are over the hump. We've got week 7, so that's good. So just halfway through, and something came up. I guess everyone was probably in the office hours on Tuesday night. But one
I
thing that,
was.
oh yeah, JT, you weren't. One of the things that kind of, although the video's posted, but one of the things that I'd like to reiterate to remind everyone is that looking back to that week 2 video. Now that you've been through it and you've seen and been exposed to stuff, looking back to week 2, especially week 3 now that we're going to get into a little bit more front end today, that's going to really help solidify a lot of the concepts because I think now we've probably accomplished most of what the new exposure to patterns, I would say. So you've pretty much seen all the patterns that we typically use, most of the common ones. And so now, if you go back and kind of rewatch or just kind of integrate some of the concepts that we covered in those last couple of weeks, they should become a little bit more familiar now. Because now at after this, I would say, except maybe for next week with context, although it's pretty much pattern based now. We're pretty much going to be just doing patterns now. And we're just going to be doing maybe slightly more complicated or slightly more built up patterns based on the root things that we've been doing over the last 6 weeks. So you guys should feel a little bit more comfortable moving into these different things. We'll be using different words maybe for deployment and stuff, but if we get into like React Native and some mobile development type things, it'll look similar to React. When we go to deploy, it's going to be a lot of Docker, so stuff that you guys have seen just deployed differently, and maybe we'll use some managed services. So a few product names that we haven't mentioned, but in the end, everything that you're going to see here on out is probably going to just be pattern based stuff. And we will probably do a microservice in Python, so we'll use Fast API, which is like the Python version of Express, things like that. But it'll all be very similar. It's all concepts we've covered. So tonight, we're going to be doing a deeper dive. Actually, tonight and next week, JC and I are going to split it. Tonight, we're going to be going over a little bit more what we call advanced front end. And the reason it's more advanced is because we're going to get into some more concepts. And tonight we're going to focus more on the language stuff. So, up until this point, we've kind of been glossing over the language. We've kind of been waving our hands like, hey, this is just a tool that you use. When really, admittedly, yes, in order to be a solid software engineer or even a systems engineer, you got to know the languages, right? At some point. So tonight we're going to start getting a little bit more into more of the intricacies of JavaScript. Now you might say, why JavaScript? I mean, why not more Python? I mean, we're engineers. We would probably, if you're doing data analysis, probably use more Python than JavaScript, and that's probably true. The reason that we choose JavaScript to focus on in this course is one, that's what we use most. The second reason being, if you're looking at really full stack systems, meaning everywhere from the client side to the web pages and everything, all the way to the back end, you can use one language, right? JavaScript. So there is some benefit to knowing and really understanding JavaScript. I think the third is actually the most critical one. The third reason I'm going to say is probably the most critical reason why we use JavaScript primarily in this boot camp. And the reason is JavaScript as a language encompasses a number of the concepts that we typically see in languages. A lot of the powerful concepts that you don't necessarily get exposed to in traditional languages like C, C++, Java. They might be there, but they're afterthoughts. Whereas a lot of the concepts that we see in JavaScript, like functional programming, asynchronous concurrent programming, things like that, are first class citizens. They're right in your face right from the beginning. And they're very powerful concepts, particularly when we're talking about connected systems and things, right? And we've already started kind of seeing those conceptually kind of come out as to powerful aspects. The things that you see in JavaScript, like what they're not necessarily unique. They're just kind of at the forefront. You have to deal with them because that's the only way to do it in JavaScript. Whereas in Python, you don't necessarily have to do things like asynchronous programming. You don't have to do things like functional programming. In fact, you typically don't when you're just sitting down to write a simple Python script. But really, those powerful things exist in Python. And you're going to be a much better systems developer conceptually from an understanding perspective, as well as a tool user, if you understand the concepts of asynchronous concurrent programming, distributed systems, and functional programming. So that's why we really focus on JavaScript. So tonight we're going to get deeper into JavaScript and concepts like closure and other things that are just fancy words for things I think that we take for granted. And you probably have run into them before if you've done any coding at any point in your career over, it could be 30 years even. You've probably run into these concepts, just haven't put a word to it. And so we're going to use JavaScript as kind of a teaching tool in those in that way. The other thing is, we're going to use JavaScript in front end programming, right? We already have. JC showed that in week 3 with React. We're going to be getting more into React tonight, deep into React, and really looking at state management, which is kind of a cool thing because as engineers, we do a lot of state management in all of our stuff. So we're going to see kind of another implementation just in front end programming of state management. And then we're going to use something called hooks, React hooks, which is kind of the new way. Back in week 3, JC introduced the concept of using classes in React. That's a natural thing to do. Tonight, we're going to do the new way of React that was introduced probably beginning of this year, called React hooks, and we'll explain why it's a little bit more, why it's being adopted, and some of the challenges with it. And then next week, you're going to solidify why we use hooks in a really big way, with context, and why people are migrating, even though it's maybe a little bit more magical on the surface than some of the stuff that maybe JC taught back in week 3. We're also going to we haven't done this in previous boot camps, but I kind of learned my lesson. When people get out of the boot camp, we kind of gloss over CSS and styling. And I think that we're going to spend a little bit of time tonight doing that, because I want you guys to be exposed so that when you get out of here and you have to potentially do styling, there's no way we're going to introduce everything, but at least you'll have an example of some styling and kind of a feeling of what goes into it. CSS is one of those things that you just end up having to, it's an experience thing. It's a new language, but it's very simple. So once you get it, it's more about Googling and Stack Overflowing. It's also very frustrating, beating your head against the wall a lot with CSS, more so than probably any other, in any other language. So let's see. Let's start there. Let's start. Let's start with CSS, and then we'll go into geez, where is this stuff? Then we'll go into closure and JavaScript and React hooks and all that kind of good stuff. And we're also going to hook up our front end to MQTT tonight, so we'll see some real-time stuff. All right, so what I'll do here is I have just opened up my development container, right? I didn't pull it all down and everything, but here it is. And what we got is I'm going to pull down, oops, I need to rename this to something else. So I am going to pull down week 6. from from GitLab here. We're going to start from there. Don't know why that's doing that. All right, GitLab. And let's do this one, full stack. We're going to do week 7 here. We got week 6. And we're going to clone this. Right. So let's go into the cloud. We're going to npm install. And then we're going to go into the React front end, or let's go into the MQTT broker, npm install there too, which is just installing those dependencies. And then we're going to go into the front end React. So this is the stuff that JC did from week 3, and some modifications that we've done over in office hours. It's all recorded at some point somewhere. The other thing that I've done is I have exposed, I went to my docker compose.yaml in my development container, and I've exposed 1885 and 1886. And the reason I did that, anyone? Why did I do that?
Access MQTT.
Exactly. So it's just so that I can use MQTT box on my Mac, on my host, to get to it. The other thing is we're going to need that when we try to access, when we get the front end to communicate back to it. Because remember, the front end we're going to be visiting in a browser, right, on our host machine. So it's actually running as a client on our host machine that's communicating with the back end, which is in a Docker container. So we're going to be mapping that appropriately. In this case, 9500, and then we got 5000 mapped to 3000 inside of the dev container. Right, so we've got that going, and we've got I'm going to start the cloud here, and I'm going to start MQTT here.
BJ, a question I had from last week on the MQTT. Do you normally use SSL to secure it as well?
Yeah, I do, and we're going to go over that in deployment.
Okay, I just figured it was a time thing, and
yeah, that's one of the more difficult things to do because of the fact that it's TCP and you have load balancers and where the actual SSL termination happens and all that kind of stuff. So that we'll go over that in a couple weeks probably.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Here. It looks like we've got some issues with MQTT. We can we'll look at those when we get to it. And then I think I know what's wrong with that. And then we have to yarn install our front end. So let's go check out our front end because it's been a while since we looked at it, right? So we got our node modules. We've got, if you remember what we did here, we've got our app.js. We've got our React router that JC put in, which allows us to switch between pages. Remember, it's a single page app. It's JavaScript that's managing everything. It's just on a single page. It's being served up by a little server. And we've got 3 pages. The home, which as it turns out is just a home component. And then we've got another one, another route called /home, which just points to the same home component. So it's just an alias, right? And then we have a third, which is the vehicles route, which displays a list of the vehicles. And so if we go and we look at our home screen, what we've got really simple, right? We've got import React, we've got home, we've got one little div container here, and we've got a header, welcome home, and this is the viewer for the FSSE vehicle simulator. Really simple. And then for the vehicle, we've got, where am I? So for the vehicle, we've got, I'm going to close all these. So we don't confuse things here. So we've got vehicles, and we've got a class here, right? Class vehicles, which is what is being put into that React router and rendered. And so we're exporting vehicles down here, which is being picked up by our app.js and imported right here, and then displayed right there, right, in that one route. And inside of here, relatively simple, we have one component did mount. And what that class method does is it just runs this code the one time when that component gets mounted. So when that page gets visited, we'll say it's mounted, but when the page gets visited, it's going to run this thing inside of here. And what it does is it goes and grabs our vehicles from the back end. And then what it does here is it renders. And it renders all of this good stuff, right? All right, so we've got that going. Let's start the front end now. So it's going to start on port 3000, and we can go over here, and we can, 5000 is mapped. We'll pull this up. We'll be good to go. All right, so perfect. So we've got this, right? This is our home screen, right? And then we've got our vehicle screen. And that is just about the ugliest screen I have ever seen in my entire life. I'm not even sure how JC lived with himself. He slept at night after making this screen. I mean,
Hey man, it wasn't
it's
easy.
awful. It is awful and ugly.
Come on, default styles.
Default styles. So let's take some time here and style this. And we'll change a little bit about the HTML or the JSX, right? But really what we'll do is we'll do it all in CSS. And so the thing about, I think JC back in week 3 kind of introduced CSS, right? Where he showed you that site that was basically the exact same HTML, but applied different style sheets, and it totally changed the look of the page. I mean, completely. It didn't even look like the same page. The only thing really was that the words were the same, right? Because it's all about the kind of the scaffolding and the structure. So one thing that we can do here is let's kind of get a plan on our design. So a lot of the design that we talk about in how you design a web page is very once again pattern based. And a lot of people say, especially engineers, oftentimes will say, "Man, I just can't design. I'm not a good designer." And yeah, it takes some intuition on what looks good and everything. I'll give you that. But there's a saying that I like, and that is the best designers steal. Now, you might say, "Man, that's a really awful thing to say." Well, it actually not. And here's why. I don't mean it that in an actual negative way. In fact, that's a very positive thing that the best designers steal. And the reason is because if you're designing something, you want someone to be able to use it, right? I mean, that's the point of doing something like this. And you know, just from personal experience, that familiarity is key when adopting something new, right? And so when I say the best designers steal, they're actually doing a good thing because what they're doing is they're taking familiar concepts from everywhere and they're applying it within the context of their ideas. So that's kind of the difference in my opinion, and I'm not going to argue with people about this because this will devolve into 3 hours of just argument on what art is, and get nowhere with it. That's the difference between art and design. Art is pushing the boundaries, pushing the limits, doing something that truly has never been done before, right? That expressing that creative emotion or whatever it is. Um, and I probably butchered that to an artist, but whatever. Design is about taking something that can feel and look good, but making it functional. And so when we as designers say, all right, I need to make this so that someone is comfortable using it, you have to steal concepts from things like, look at how Apple does it. People are used to using their iPhone. Okay, well, how does the iPhone implement these types of patterns? One of the most common patterns you see are cards, right? They're really nice. You see cards on your smartphone. They're easy to scroll. They're easy to map. It really forces you to map the information appropriately and all this kind of stuff. So let's steal that concept. And what we can say is, well, how do I make something look good with a card? Well, the thing that I do is I go to google.com and I say card UX UI. I go to the images tab and I just start scrolling. And I start looking for something that catches my eye. And I say, hey, that looks kind of good. Like this thing right here looks cool with cards. So I'll scroll through here. That's neat. Oh, that's kind of cool. Stuff like that. And it's like, well, I need to find something that kind of matches this. So, oh, this is kind of cool. I'm just randomly looking here. It's got a title. It's got a picture associated with it. Well, we have a picture, right? We have a picture of a car. We got a title of it. We got some information we want to map, from a data perspective. So none of these cards really show that, but maybe we can extrapolate a little bit. We can use these kind of concepts of an image and a card. Now design is in the details, right? And so if we look at this, we say, okay, well, what is about this? Well, if you notice, the background in this is all white. And another thing I'll mention, less is more in design, always. Less is always more. And so this is a very common pattern that you see. The white background with a little white smoke. But you also notice here that to maybe an uninformed observer, you might think this is a solid color. It's actually not. There's a gradient associated with this gray. If you look at it, it's very slight. There's like a radial gradient. The other thing you'll notice if we're going through here, that this card is very flat. The only difference between that white and that gray is the fact that it's white and gray. But let's look down here. This is actually an older style, a little bit to 2018, 2019. So let's look a little bit 2020. 2020 is what we call neuromorphism, and that is the idea, just a big word to an obvious concept, as designers like to do, and all non-technical people. Really, what we've got is the ability to show some sort of three dimension, and that's what neuromorphism is. The ability to really somehow articulate that three dimensionality. And how does that work? It's like, oh geez, lost it. It's like, how does that work? How do they do that? Well, it's actually one thing. It's really simple. It's just a box shadow around that. So you're just actually applying a shadow to this box, which is just once again another gradient underneath. And so I like this better because one, it's more 2020 than 2019. I'm also a big fan of box shadows. I just kind of like that look. So let's kind of borrow this kind of style, taking into account the details of this, and start applying it to our stuff. All right, that's the end of my little design stuff. From here on out, I'll just start doing stuff. But it's all about in the details of those things. All right, so let's do this. So I'm only going to style this our vehicle page here, and let's start up here with this nav bar. Now, one thing about the nav bar that's nice in React is that we can share components, and JC set it up so that both pages, home and vehicle, share this nav bar. So, and it's in one component called nav bar. And so we're going to take this component, we're going to style this component. Now, how do we do that? Well, we're going to create a new file called navbar.module.css. And these are React CSS modules. You can read all about them. There it is, this one. You can read about them here in this link. No, maybe not. Where is it? I don't know why the main one. Hey, JC, will you find the official documentation on the React modules, CSS modules? But really all it is it's saying I'm only going to apply these styles to this page, to this navbar page. And what I can do is, even though this is a CSS file, so now a totally different language, what I can do is I can import as styles a variable from navbar.module.css. And so anything I do in here will be put into the styles. And so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to start kind of styling this. All right, I'm going to make a class called navigation container. And in the navigation container, you might get a little bit mad at me here because I'm not going to explain everything. This is just stuff you got to read about. This is more about exposure to this kind of stuff. But display, there's a number of different gridded patterns you can do. We're going to use flexbox here. There's also grid. We'll use grid a little bit later. And then there's the old way, which is floats. Don't use floats anymore. And then you can also use just like inline block and blocks and stuff like that. So we're going to create this navigation bar, and we're going to say, all right, well, the max height is going to be about 80 pixels. We're going to style, we're styling this thing right here. And if we load up our little dev tools here, it is this thing, this UL or this nav component that we're really wanting to style. So I'm going to say class name, which is a React thing. Styles, it's a React, but it maps to class in the HTML DOM. We're going to say styles.navigation container.
Yeah, that's because the class was already reserved for an actual class, right?
Yeah, the class keyword was already reserved in JavaScript, so they had to change it to everything else pretty much maps one-to-one. Keywords to HTML attributes. So we got class name. All right, that's good. So I'm going to move this over here so we can see kind of both. Unfortunately, oops. All right. So we've got this, and then let's do a border on the bottom. And we'll make the border bottom like 1 pixel. So what did that do? Well, nothing right now. Do 1 pixel, and we'll make it a color. Give it a gray color, and we'll make it solid. And what did that do? Well, it put that line right there. It's pretty cool. And then let's give it a box shadow. And we'll make that box shadow offset 2 pixels. And we'll color it. And so now you're starting to see, right, that raised kind of 3-dimensionality there. And I want to make the padding 0. Now in CSS or HTML in general, the padding is what's inside of the container. Margin is what's outside the container, right? So always kind of remember that as you go. So now I want to style. So if I'm looking at the structure, I've got nav, I've kind of styled this outer container, but now I want to start styling the stuff that's inside. So I need to now kind of target this UL tag, and I am going to copy that and start scoping that to UL. So I'm going to say anything that's this class that's labeled this class. Any component that's UL inside of this class, I want to apply these styles. Once again, I'm going to do a flex display, and I'm going to say padding is equal to 0. And you'll notice now that they've changed, right? So they went from that to flex. I flexed them. And so now we've run them up against each other, and the default is a flex row. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time because we'd be here the rest of the night explaining that. But then I'm going to now target each one of these LIs because I need to kind of separate these. I need to get rid of those dots right there that are part of the list, right? The UL LI list, which is kind of default for HTML tag. So, all right, cool. So we've got this, and then we need to target that LI. So LIs are always inside of ULs. So I'm going to do an LI here, and I'm going to say list style is none. And what that's doing is targeting that circle, right? That little dot. So that's out. And then I'm going to give it some margin. What is this? What am I doing here? Well, I'm actually saying the margin all the way around the container. And this is 0 at the top, 20 at the right, 20 pixels at the right, 0 at the bottom, and then 20 pixels at the left. Goes clockwise. So if we look what happened there, nice. We got those spaced, right? So 0 top and bottom, and 20 left and right. And then what we can also do is if we notice inside this link is actually probably an A tag. Yep, it is. Because this, as it turns out, this link right here in React maps to an A tag in HTML. And so what we can do here is we can target that A tag to make sure that we change this color. Like I don't want it to be underlined, right? So what I can do is I can target the text decoration to be none. So we're going to get rid of that underline, and then we're going to change the color of the text. We're just going to make it black. There we go. Or blue. Right? And then we're going to make the font weight bold. Nice. I love myself a good Times New Roman, as everyone does, but this font is really starting to bug me. So let's do some font stuff. Let's go find a good Google font. Google has a bunch of free fonts. You can browse like crazy. This one looks good. And let's select this style. We can go to the embed, and we can see here that we can embed this into our HTML because this is just a link tag. But where do we do that in React? Well, in React, we can go to our public and go to the index.html because remember, everything is still HTML. Oh, we're just letting JavaScript manage it for us. So we're just open up the page, the one page, the one HTML page that everything happens in. We're just going to add this to the top here. Oops. And it's just pulling from fonts.googleapis.com/CSS, and it's pulling this Alata font. And here's the CSS rule right here that I'm going to use. And I'm going to go to index.css. And I'm going to say in the body, I want to use this font family. And I'm going to get rid of the current one. But you'll notice it didn't change. Why didn't it change? Well, because this index.css was not actually being imported. And so we need to actually import this index.css because JC removed it, probably commented it out. And you'll notice now the font's changed. Pretty cool. So we got that kind of taken care of. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So we've basically done what I want to do, I guess, right now for this. I guess the navigation container, I kind of want some margin around that. So we'll just do some 10 pixels of margin. You'll notice we picked up a little bit of space there. That's good. The other thing is I would really like this whole page, right? This whole body to have some space around it, right? And so what we could do is we can look at this, and navbar is not the place to do that, right? We need to we really should go to maybe our index.css and maybe do it at the body, and maybe we can say margin. We'll just do 10 or 1 rem, another unit of measure rather than pixels, more of a relational. And you'll notice we now get a bit of some margin on the left there, and it's actually a margin around the whole thing. It's a shorthand for doing 1 1 1 1, right, all the way around. Okay, so we've got that, and now at this point we really should start to look at styling these things. Now I went around that whole card thing. This nav bar is acting as a card, but let's make each one of our vehicles act as a card. Okay. So where do we do that? Well, we have to go to vehicles here, and we need to do the same thing. We need to create a vehicles.module.css and put this over here, and then we got to import it. Styles from okay. We got to go down to where these things are starting to be rendered. You can see it right here. Looks like this. This is where it all starts. Cool. Oops. Can't resolve vehicles.module.css. Why not? There we go. All right, so each one of these should be a card. And let's... Now, one thing that JC did not do is he didn't really contain this in a way, because he didn't really have to, because he wasn't really going for styles here. We're going to have to contain this a little bit better so we have some ability to make sure that we can organize how these, because this is one card, right? Because we're going to convert each one of these vehicle information kind of chunks, these sections, into cards, but we need a container to hold all the cards so that we can make sure that they wrap and flow and all this kind of stuff. So I'm going to create a div around that, and add a class name, styles.cardContainer. I haven't actually defined card container, but I'm going to do it up here. And we'll do a display. Instead of flex here, I'm going to say display grid. And I'm going to do a grid template columns. And I want 3 columns. In a certain view, I want 3 columns. And I'm just going to say auto, auto, auto. You could also do 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, or 1 FR, which is fraction, 3 FR, which is a 3 to 1 fraction, 1 FR. There's a number of different units of measurement you can use. I'm just going to say auto so that they auto kind of format through. And then I'm going to say a column gap. So I want a gap between the cards. And I want that column gap to be 10 pixels. And I'll say the row gap, which is the up and down gap, I want that to be 15 pixels. So vertically. Okay, so still nothing happening there, but that's okay, because we haven't really done anything yet. So now what we have to do is we need to add an actual card. So because, oops, this is actually not going to work, because this is actually going to render each one of those things. So what we actually have to do is bound down here, we need to actually put this. And the reason is now, why did we do that? Well, we actually want to contain the vehicle card list, which is being rendered here. And then you go through the map, right? And you're just going to do one after the other through that vehicle list that we get from the API, from the back end. So that's fine. And then each one of these, we're now going to style them as cards. So style.card. And this is where the magic starts happening. So let's make the max width 350 pixels. Anyone know why I'm making it 350 pixels and not 400 or 500 or 200 or 100?
Is that for mobile?
It's really for mobile. There's not too many screens that are smaller than 350 pixels. And if they are, we don't care about them because they're probably in such low usage. And they're not your primary target. So we're starting to see something happen, right? We're saying the max was 350 pixels. As it turns out, you'll notice here how we've gridded it. There's our 3. You're saying, why is there 6 vehicles? Well, because I have 6 in my database, actually. I bet if I pull up my tables plus here, yeah, I've got my user vehicle. You'll notice I have 6 in there. I'll delete them so it looks more like oh no. All right. Let me go create some vehicles again. Okay. Maybe we were creating 6. I don't remember, JC. Maybe there were literally 6 in there.
Well, it just depends on how many times we run you run the client to load them up.
Yeah, but I just showed that there were 6. Maybe that wasn't the database that I thought I was hitting. Yeah, I don't know. Well, now we have 9, so we have 9 now. We're just going to keep it as that. We're not going to waste time with that. All right, so here's what we got. I'm actually more of a fan of, instead of, I want this background of this whole page to be a white smoke. I want it to be like a gray. I don't want it, because I want my card backgrounds to be white. And so I'm going to go to my index.css here, and I'm going to make the HTML component background white smoke. So you notice it's slightly off-white. That's good. And then what we're going to do here, we're going to say the background is going to be completely white. You'll notice before you probably didn't see a difference, and it may even be a little bit hard to see now, even through Zoom, but you'll notice that this is white, and that's kind of slightly gray here. And it'll come together here. So now let's make some neuromorphism stuff. We're gonna elevate that a little bit. 2px, 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 and we'll make the border shadow a little bit gray. There we go. Now we're pretty much set off, and there's other settings you can do, but that's good enough for now. The other thing we do, we got a lot of overflow on that, so we're going to make the overflow hidden. So now we're starting to contain this stuff, right? And we got the padding bottom. We're gonna add some padding there, make it 10 pixels. So we've got that. All right, cool. So now that we have that, we've got some options here in terms of what we could do with our styling. We can choose to style. Let's work on this card here. So from a design perspective, I don't like this image being on the bottom. I actually want it to be at the top of the card and take up the full top of the card, so full width. And it's going to give us some kind of an offset, and that's what's going to draw your eye. The other thing is this image is pretty big, and so we're going to have to resize it with CSS to fit inside of this this thing here. So what we can do is I'm going to create a card image container, and I'm going to do height, and I'll do like 120 pixels here. And here's the thing, since I want to move this guy up here, I'm going to move this guy to the very top. So a little bit of JSX difference editing here. I'm going to make a container. I'm going to say the style, not style, class name, styles.card image container. You'll notice now, oh man, that's really huge. So one thing that we're going to want to do is we're now going to remove this guy. And instead of it being, we're going to use an image tag here, I am going to add a, I'm going to add a style. I'm going to do some inline styles here directly in the JSX. So it's gonna be CSS, but it's gonna be a JavaScript version of the CSS. The only difference, they map really well keyword wise. The only difference is instead of doing this dash, which wouldn't be valid JSON for variable name, they use camel case. So, and that's actually what happens in when this CSS module gets mapped to JavaScript. It just converts this dash hyphen case to and snake case to camel case. So I'm going to do a background image. So I'm going to let CSS kind of manage the background image. I'm going to say URL because we're pulling it from the API, specifically that vehicle object, and I'm going to just say vehicle dot image URL. In fact, I'm just going to use the same one here and put it right there. So we're doing that, and then how does that look? All right, so that worked actually. Now with the top of the card is the full length image, so we're good. The only bad thing here, of course, is that you can't see the car. So we're gonna have to kind of play with this thing a little bit. So in here, we can now apply the background. We can say background position, center that, and then background. So what did that do? Not much. And then let's do a background size, and let's cover. There we go. Look at that. So we moved that vehicle in to the middle here, and there's a ton of other options we could do, but that's good enough for me right now. And now we've got this this heading right here. I'm a little unhappy with how that heading is so far left. You know, it's right there on the edge, so I'm going to change this. Since it's already in an H3, I'm going to be a little bit lazy. I'm just going to do an H3 here, and I'm just going to say margin left, I don't know, 10 pixels. So we'll do a margin left. So we've pulled this out. And now what's left is this. I also don't like this undefined and undefined. Why is that, guys?
Just pulling data from the server, right?
Right. And as it turns out, the back end doesn't have that data. Because I think we did some stuff maybe in office hours or something or whatever, where that was the vehicle make and model. But the make we've abstracted into another table, and it's not mapped to the back end. So that is an exercise for the viewer. That's a little bit of homework there. So make sure that that works. I'm going to leave it in here as undefined and undefined. So it maybe gets on your nerves a little bit and makes you go and do it, right? That certainly happened to me. Okay, and then we're going to look at this. So now what's left, basically, is to style this thing, this data container. So let's go here, and we're going to make a another container, card data container. All of this is convention. There's no special way I'm naming things, or that word container doesn't mean anything. It's all just convention. And I'm going to give it this some padding. I'm going to say 10 pixels. And I'm going to make a new thing here. JC didn't actually, he was kind of leveraging the UL thing here. And so I'm going to just, once again, make a class name, styles dot card data container. So we got some padding in there, that's good. And let's see if we can make that margin 0. What if we made this 0? Well, let's leave it like that for now, and then we'll get back to it. Now this UL stuff is getting a little bit frustrating for me, because I mean, why really use this list when really we can structure it a little bit differently in the HTML? It's actually pretty rare nowadays to see UL LI stuff. You're going to see more div containers. So I'm going to change these UL to divs, and I'm going to change these LIs to div. All right. And now we've got that. And so that's the reason that we're going to do card data container, and we're going to do some padding here, 10 pixels. Line it up right with there. And now that doesn't look too great. So what I'd really like is one. I'd like it to actually map the right thing here, right? And I changed that from ID to UID because our API changed through some of that. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to label this in a specific way, right? These are just labels. One thing from a UI perspective, if you're designing this for an end user, grandma doesn't really know what a UID is. It means nothing to her. So I'm going to just kind of move this thing kind of down to the bottom for now. Kind of out of the way. We'll keep it there, and maybe do something with it later. But what I'm going to say here is you have a pattern here, right? You've got label and data. It's one of the hardest things to style well. There's really no good way to do this. So I'm basically going to I'm going to say span, which is another HTML tag, and I'm going to span both of these things. So now we have this and that, and then that and that, and so we've got a label and we have a value. So the label is let's make the color well, like a lighter gray. And we'll make the font size a little bit smaller. Jeez, autocomplete. Make it a little bit smaller, and we'll make the min width like 100 pixels. And what we have to do here now is just like the other things, we need to do styles dot label. So you'll notice now that name, which is what we just did, is exactly like that. We can do the exact same thing over here. And right there. Okay, and then let's also do a value. So what is the value going to look like? We'll also make that font size smaller. I'll make the color a little bit darker. And we'll do the same thing. We'll move that to there. Too much Russian today. And now we've noticed that a little bit smaller, a little bit darker, and it kind of works that way. We just got to move this kind of stuff down to the value here. So we're going to move this. We got to close that span tag. Got to move it over like that. We have one more value to apply that to here, to this thing. All right. So now we should see pretty much everything, so that's good. And then this is kind of a special case, so I'm just going to make an inline style here. Font size, and we'll just make this like real small. And we'll just say color, like a really light gray, so we can kind of see that down there. All right, so it's looking a little better. A little bit better. There's a lot of space right here, which is completely unnecessary. You might say, well, how do I figure out like what's going on there? Well, you can see by just doing an inspect that there's a lot of margin bottom on this H3 tag. Well, we already kind of dealt with this H3 tag, so we can change this margin bottom to 0. See if that helps at all. Yeah, that helped close that gap a little bit. We also kind of want to close the gap probably on this card data container. And so if we go find the card data container, we can do a margin bottom and just do it like a 10 pixels there. Give us some space. Ooh, I think we need to move our thing outside of that card. There we go, like that. Maybe some padding left. There we go. So we have that UID down there at the bottom. The other thing that I want to add is, I think I want to add a last report time. So vehicle, so really what we want to do here is we want to say vehicle.id. So vehicle data of ID, and we're going to do timestamp. The problem is that's going to fail because sometimes that data doesn't exist. So what we can do, we can start adding that question mark. There's a little syntactic sugar that just does a check real quick. whether that exists. If it exists, otherwise it'll return null and it won't display anything. So you'll notice that the last report, well, is nothing. Now, why is that? Well, because we're using ID here as opposed to UID. And that still isn't going to work, right? Because we haven't mapped this correctly. We need to change all of this vehicle.id to vehicle.UID. So I'm going to do a really quick change to everything. And now we got everything going. It's good. So last report was this number. You can all read epoch timestamps, right? Like by now, like you can just see that number and know exactly what the date is, right? It's like reading a clock. It should be by now. If it's not, then we're all doing something wrong. It's a total joke. So let's make sure that we format this a little bit better. So I am going to install yarn add a library called Moment, and Moment gives us a lot of cool date date libraries and stuff. So it's just another library that we'll add that's going to give us some nice nice functionality, and we can format this this date. And then instead of just doing that massive JSON string, which means nothing to anybody really, let's just get the thing that really matters, like the speed, and just do that. So instead of there being vehicle data and this big old thing, let's just do vehicle data dot vehicle speed, and then we'll just add a unit there. So that's cool. So the last one was 14, but that's really long. No one cares about. I mean, unless you guys care about the the trillionth digit, decimal point. Probably not. That resolution and speed probably isn't that critical. So let's do a .to fixed. Now we're in JavaScript, and we'll just do a .to fixed 1. You'll notice that to fixed is just going to round it for us. We could also use JavaScript round. There's some idiosyncrasies with this. We'll just do to fixed, and in fact, does it really matter? Just do to fixed of 0. And we can do that. We can also, instead of doing to fixed, we can also do a parse int and get the int from it to the integer, which will lob off the thing and probably take the floor or the ceiling. You can also do math.ceiling if you wanted the ceiling, whatever it is. So you guys can choose, all of that kind of stuff. So we got that. Then we got the last report. Let's see, we're done. What? Huh. That's weird. So import moments. Why is it not?
Week 6.
That's where we're at right now. Why is it not letting me install Moment? That's really frustrating.
Didn't you change to week 7?
Mm-mm. Let's see if it. I'll just stop it so I don't have to restart it. Let's see if it. It's really strange. But while we're waiting for that, oh, it stopped. While we're waiting for that, there's a few other things that we can kind of, mess with here. You can start looking at, well, we can't because, darn it. One of the things that, while we're waiting for this to take its time installing, one of the things that we really haven't discussed is responsive. Now, you might have heard this before in when someone says, "Is the web page responsive?" And you might say, well, sure, you can click and stuff on it, right? It's got buttons, it's somewhat responsive. That's not actually what they mean. What they mean by the word responsive is, does it also work on mobile as well as desktop? Does the same page work on mobile and desktop and everything in between, basically tablets, right? And so that's one of the things that strategically you might ask, there's a billion different ways to do things. I showed you one way. The reason that I'm doing it that way is because those things are actually more set up to be better responsive, to be able to flex with, like Flexbox is all about flexing with the screen sizes. Grid, the CSS Grid, which came out earlier, probably or late last year as a kind of an accepted standard, is all about laying out things in the context of responsive web pages. And so we really haven't done much yet, but one thing that we can do is, you'll notice if this thing was running, that as it gets smaller, we still have 3 columns. And it's going to force it to be 3 columns. We don't want that. We actually want it to be, every time this screen gets small enough, we want it to switch from 3 columns to maybe 1 column or 2 columns. But let's just do switch to 1 column. So what we can do in CSS is something called a media query. So there's a keyword in CSS, and we can say screen, and when that's basically what we're saying is, this media query, when the screen size is of a certain width, less or more, then do something else with these specific classes, CSS classes. So we're going to say, and so when it's only screen and the max width of the screen is below 600 pixels. And why 600? Well, it's a pretty good breakpoint on tablets and what we're doing. And plus, you can think of the cards. Well, we're doing like 350 is a small screen. This is all just experience stuff. You look it up, you learn it, and go. And so, really, what we want is we want to kind of change these things. And the biggest thing we need to change, fortunately, is really just one thing or a couple things, is in this card container. We basically want to change this grid from 3 to 1. So we're going to say, all right, we're going to copy and paste this card container down here. We want to inherit the rest of these. We want these to stay the same, but we really want this thing to change. We want it to change it to 1 column. So when that screen is less than 600 pixels, it's going to preferentially select this thing and overwrite this this option, the CSS key value pair. And I also want to, the other thing that's going to happen here is they're not going to be justified center, because we didn't want that when we had 3 across. Instead, what we want now is we want it to be justified center, so we're going to say justify content center. Come on. Start it up. Are you serious? What the heck is going on? I have no idea. For some reason, Babel isn't playing nice. I'd really hate to have to go through this again. There's probably a yarn lock on this too. So one of the things that you'll notice is that I think there's an issue with some of the versions of the library that I'm using. And so maybe from a few weeks ago or whatever, and so I deleted that yarn lock. I know that maybe some of you have actually had that issue. JC may have helped you guys. What I just did was I'm just deleting the node modules inside of here, and I'm going to just reinstall. But I also deleted that yarn lock file so that it will install all new libraries without any preconceived notions of what version number you need or any of that kind of stuff. And so hopefully with that, we'll be able to get this thing to get reinstalled and go here. All right. Another thing I'm going to do here is I'm probably going to modify the width of the card, and we'll just do like we'll just say the min width is like 340 pixels. Because we'll be able to kind of see it on the so we'll just install everything again. It'll take some time here. All right, so any questions while we're waiting for that to install? That's actually the end of the CSS stuff, fortunately. So we made it almost all the way through, and then we'll get into JavaScript next. But any questions about CSS?
I have a question about building web pages.
Sure.
Are you allowed, so with the images that you're pulling, what are the copyright requirements around images on web pages? Can you just go and...
Just use anything until someone comes after you for it.
Okay. All right.
Maybe I should have paused the video before saying that, but...
Okay.
I mean, if you want to get really pedantic about it, yeah, you should probably check into the copyrights. And technically, Google shouldn't show it on their search results if they're copyrighted. If you're like, what everyone should do, and for really large like digital agencies, they will pay exorbitant licensing for stock images and stuff, and modify them and all that kind of stuff. Like Getty's, Getty's image is a big one, Adobe stock. So if you're really concerned and you're doing some pretty high profile stuff, yeah, definitely do that. If you're putting together a personal website, no one cares. Just copy and paste. And typically we do it actually with the best intentions in mind. Initially we'll just do something fast. Like the images JC pulled, there's probably some copyright associated with them, but it would need to get big enough before even the people who own it care, and we're not making money off of it really, so the chances are it wouldn't even hold up. So you kind of have to be considerate, and typically we do it with best intentions to say, look, if this gets big enough, obviously we'll pay for whatever the stock licenses are if it's a perfect image, or go find another one that's free or whatever. So yeah, they're there, but I typically don't worry about it until it matters. Or give credit to someone in the code, in a comment that gets transpiled out.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I do in presentations and stuff like that. So I figure that I just didn't know if web pages had different rules.
Sometimes they'll be very specific about like attribution, like you're supposed to give attribution to the artist or the photographer or whatever. A lot of times what you'll see is they'll give attribution, but it'll be in comments in the HTML. So you literally have to know enough to pull up the dev tools, look in the HTML, and see that it's been so.
So that's a way of getting out of posting it on the page, but still having it, is to put it in comments in the HTML or something like that.
I've seen that before. I bet if someone got really serious about it in court, I bet it wouldn't hold up, but and I don't know if there's prior art to that, or um, precedent for that, legal precedent for that. I'm sure there is, but maybe Clayton in his 9 or whatever years of legal forensic work came across some of that, but um, who knows? Now you might ask, how are we supposed to know all those keywords and stuff? That's just many years of beating my head against the wall with CSS. It's a very frustrating thing. And I still only know enough to be dangerous, so on CSS. I know enough to do what I want to do. But I've seen some pretty crazy CSS artists. And there's called like SCSS, which is like a mod where you can actually nest your CSS classes in each other and all that kind of stuff, and then it transpiles then. And I've seen we use a lot of CSS variables too to template and theme things, so it's a little bit. You can use calculations too in it now, where you can actually like calculate dynamically paddings and stuff based on sizing and stuff like that.
So do you tend to try and design for both mobile and desktops, or do you
always? In fact, we always design for both. What we design for is mobile first, because about 60 to 70%, I forget what the exact percentage number, but 60 or 70% of all web pages are visited by smartphones and small screens. So you'll notice here. What's
pretty
that?
easy. I said you can track that pretty easily. I mean, it's not that hard to collect some data and verify that most people are coming to your website on a phone.
Yeah, through Google Analytics and stuff like that. That's in our digital marketing course. Go take our digital marketing course. That doesn't exist, but you'll learn all about that stuff. Google Analytics and tracking and geo stuff and everything. So you'll notice that after reinstalling, it fixed itself, and you'll notice that we went from 3, and if we drag this over and we crossed that 600, see up here, you'll see up at the top right, you can see the pixel width, that first pixel number. When we drop below 600, you'll notice it went to 1, right? So that's responsive. That is responsive in action. You can play with those numbers and everything, so you'll notice that. And then the min width was 340, so we don't go any below that. So if someone somehow had a phone that was only 180 pixels wide, that's how it would look. So they're kind of all over the place, but for the most part, they're somewhat conformant. So you'll notice that grid starts to come into play when you have a wider screen, which is nice in our Macs. So yes, but we always design mobile first. So that's why we did that. And then with CSS, you can also change this nav bar. We're not going to do that because you probably got real bored there towards the end. Very tedious, right? Just doing styling. But we can make this so that it becomes a hamburger menu up at the top. Those 3 lines, that becomes what you would normally see on a smartphone and stuff like that. So we can also change this so the nav bar disappears, right? When it goes to a certain amount. So. Anyways, one last thing. That whole thing that started this ridiculousness was this number here, because Grandma, all of us know how to read these numbers, but Grandma doesn't. So let's do this format for using moment. So we're going to import moment. Hopefully all right. So that, I guess, worked. That's good. So let's use this down here. Let's find our timestamp right here. We say moment, and we're going to have to multiply by 1,000 because the API says that you need to pass a Unix timestamp, but in milliseconds. So we're going to pass that milliseconds, but we know that from our API that it comes back in seconds, so we have to add times 1,000 to get milliseconds. And then we're going to say dot from now. What from now does, it's a nice little API that's provided by Moment, and it gives us an invalidate. Great. Why is it invalidate? There we go. Last report.
Oh, cool.
2 days ago. That's pretty cool. So I must have worked on this 2 days ago.
That's cool.
Last time I ran sumo was 2 days ago. So, anyways, that's pretty cool, right?
That is pretty cool.
It's CSS, one of those things you get really frustrated with, but it's very rewarding at the end. And web pages in general, design in general. Okay, so next thing we'll do is we will hook up MQTT, so we'll actually get some dynamic stuff happening on this page. But we'll take a break before that because we're going to get into closure and JavaScript and kind of get into the weeds here moving in. But at least it looks a little better. I always hate developing web pages first structurally and the code and everything to make them dynamic if they don't look good. I always want something to look good. Not that this looks great, but it looks better than it did. I want to do that because it's much nicer to develop in, right? if you enjoy looking at it a little bit more, right? So that's my preference. Andrew Palm, one of our developer front end guys, who most of the stuff comes from in one way or another, because he's a rock star. He likes to actually do all of the actual functional stuff first, and then do the styling at the end. So it's really whatever floats your boat. So all right, let's take a break. Come back in about 5 minutes, and we'll dive into JavaScript.
And Habij, I have a question.
Sure.
So there are some pages where you will see an option like, you want to continue with the web browser or switch to mobile thing.
Yeah.
So where it comes in here.
Yeah, so that's actually more of a legacy thing. The reason you see a lot of that is that I will say there are some features you just can't do. And you need an entirely different code base. A lot of times they'll actually bundle code differently, or they'll cut out a lot of data. And so if you're on mobile, instead of like mucking up your front end code to where you have like basically completely different versions for mobile or for desktop, they may cut it. They may actually just deploy a totally separate website for mobile to save data or do something differently. Or I think the majority of that is because of legacy. They implemented their website first in a time when mobile first wasn't a thing, and they just kind of carried that through. And then when it came time, there was an initiative within the enterprise to say, hey, we need a mobile site. And they're like, well, I can't use this. This is old, and it doesn't even use React. We want to use React now. So make a new thing. And then you just switch on the user agent and do that. That's probably the majority of cases. The other the thing that the mobile site, the reason we do that a lot is to drive you to experiences from an advertising perspective. So you can get advertising hits if you can get a browser to carry a token or a referral code, and it's all kind of hashed in cookies and stuff within the browser. A lot of times they want you to click on that in order to get an additional click in order to maximize their referral revenue. For ad stuff, that's a not as common thing. And then the other thing is they may want to drive you to like a native app experience. They want you to download their app so they can really control the experience and all that kind of stuff, keep you there, and also be able to collect more data because you can get GPL location and all that kind of stuff if they share it with you. And so there's a lot of semi-nefarious, more just marketing reasons why you might see that, but I think the majority of it's probably just because of legacy. All right, JC, so only a few hiccups. Thanks for giving me like the ugliest, nastiest web page. We'd have wasted like an entire hour doing this.
Hey, that's a great example of CSS, right?
Yeah.
You're the plastic surgeon.
That's right. That's right. do some closure here. Oh man, we're just gonna get fun. I actually did have an example of this nav bar, changing it to full CSS to the hamburger menu and everything. But
Sorry, say that again.
I do have a version that has the changes. I was going to do this nav bar to change a hamburger menu and stuff, but it's starting to become tedious. Just not worth it.
Now we just got to make separate pages for each vehicle.
Go for it. Actually, that's in context next week. I think maybe that should be something we cover, because you're gonna have to push most of this vehicle stuff up into context, along with the user management, and even MQTT if you really want to. Although you should probably just leave that. That actually gets into some pretty sophisticated crap.
If
References
Well,
are.
we'll see if there's time. One thing I wouldn't mind doing is actually bringing up like when you go into a vehicle, right? Having an edit vehicle page as well.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Show a post for that.
Form validation.
That's one thing we've done in the past is form validation.
So introduce Formic.
Yeah, that'd be good. All right, so we justified that a little bit. One more stuff. See, it's all in the details. Right, everyone back? All right, cool. So let's get into some JavaScript. Any other questions about CSS? So last time we'll mention it. You can spend time with it if you want, but it's good to know that that's what goes on. Right. So, like I said before, up until this point, we haven't really been going over language stuff. We've really just been saying, it's kind of a tool. Don't worry about it. You'll get it if you spend time with it. Well, now that you guys have a lot of the concepts, and this is kind of what separates you from as engineers, trained engineers from people doing regular boot camps or whatever, and that is the ability to understand the concept from a system perspective and not get all tied up with the languages and the tools, because we do use technical tools like this every day in our own areas. And so now we're going to shift a little bit and really start talking about what JavaScript is. And really, the thing about React is it's all about closure, especially when we start talking about hooks. But before I start talking about hooks, let's talk about what we just did, or specifically what JC did a few weeks ago. You'll notice here I started kind of describing, just to kind of refresh what we were doing here in our front end. This is a class. And if you looked at if you watched the prep videos, I have a whole video about object-oriented programming, right? And data structures and algorithms, I think. This is object-oriented programming, right? There's a class, it's got a vehicle, it's got methods, component did mount, render method, and it's got properties, specifically in this case, a state associated with it. And every time you load up this vehicle, it truly is a class. And when you instantiate it, it becomes an object, and that object carries its own state around with it. And that's why it's very appropriate for React. Well, JavaScript doesn't really, it's not really nice about it, because object-oriented programming is not a first-class citizen within JavaScript. It's a functional language. Classes were actually added as kind of an afterthought. Even though everything is an object in JavaScript, true object-oriented programming isn't really a big part of JavaScript. In fact, the inherent start of JavaScript started with the prototypes. You might see that in some of your reading about JavaScript, the prototype structure. And you probably haven't seen us do any prototype stuff. And we rarely do. It's a very front-end oriented concept. And quite frankly, if we're going to do something with a class, we kind of force it into this paradigm. So let's talk about what React is at a very basic kind of, very basic sort of level. I'm just going to create a new file here. And so CD projects, I'll get back to our week 6 here. All right. So create a new file here. And if you notice, going back to here, I'm going to actually go to navbar. Same thing, but it's a little bit easier to read because it's a simpler component, right? So we have a render here, but let's look at this line here, line 5. We have a navbar, what we've created, and it's extending an object. So what we're doing is we're inheriting all of the fields, methods, properties, everything that's included in this React.component, which just comes from the library React that we got from NPM. And we're just extending it to create our own. And so it has a bunch of stuff underneath that's actually happening when we actually instantiate this object, or this class, to make it an object, this navbar. So let's make our own kind of structure, just to, so we're going to say base component. So we're just creating a new JavaScript class called base component. This is the same thing. I'm kind of emulating what this is, React.component. So I'm kind of remaking this React.component for, illustrative purposes. And so inside of this base component, we have a, like every good object-oriented programming language, we have a constructor. What does a constructor do? It's a method that gets run when the object is instantiated, when the class is instantiated and made an object. And so you can do things here, and within the context of React, we need to give it a state. So we'll just say this dot state is equal to an empty thing, because this is basically a template, right? It's a concrete template for all components that we'll make from it. And let's do this. Let's give it a set state. We'll make this a method. Now in JavaScript, this might look a little bit weird. What did I just do? Well, this is a method because we're setting this equal to a lambda function, or an arrow, what we said, an arrow function, an anonymous function. And you've seen a lot of these. It's just another way of saying of doing a function. You can also, this is equivalent to what I just said as an arrow function, and technically it's equivalent to this, kind of. Actually, it's not, and the reason is because this is a method within a class. This is just a procedure, just a function outside of a class. And the syntax in JavaScript does not allow you to put the word function here in front. So we'll just do this, and I'm going to change that back to our arrow function. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say new state. So we're going to do the set state here. And we're going to say this dot state is equal to this dot state. If we all of you were here for office hours or should have watched the videos, JT, and we got this destructuring, right, or this spread operator. We've got new states, and let's also give ourselves a render method, and this render method will just print out console log this dot state. So that's pretty cool, right? What we can also do, it's all right. Yeah, it's all right. So if we instantiate this base component, just really quick, we'll just do a bc equals, do a let bc equals our base component, do bc.render. We're going to run this in Node. That's stretching the truth a little bit, right? Because we don't actually run front-end stuff in Node. It gets run in the browser. Fortunately, it's all the V8 JavaScript engine, so we're just going to do it here because it's easy. I don't want to boot up all the infrastructure for the browser to do this. And then what we'll do here is we'll just run this index. Well, it fails. Why? Well, because I'm trying to set this base component equal directly, but really what we need to do is we need to create a new instance of base component. So I'm going to use the new keyword, and I need to save it, and then run it again, and you'll notice, print out the state. Well, it's empty, right? Because there's nothing in it. All we did was just print out this empty state. All right, cool. So that's good. It runs. So now let's create a component that's extending our base component, our little React example here. And so let's create a counter component. And all this counter does is it counts up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and keeps setting the state, right? Just the very simplest example. We'll call it counter class. And we need it to extend our base component. And what we can do is we can call the constructor here. We're going to use a special function provided to every base class, and that's called super. And what super does, it instantiates all of the parent classes, parent class. So in this case, base components, all of its methods and all of its properties and all this kind of stuff, and gives it to our current class, basic object-oriented stuff. So I'm going to call super here, and this dot state is equal to counter equals 0. So this is us making our own component now. And we're just gonna create a method called click. So that's like if we click a button in the browser, right? And every time we click, we want this counter to increment up. So we're gonna do this dot set state. And we're going to say counter. Let's go to this dot state dot counter plus 1. Because it's starting at 0. Every time we click, it's just going to increment up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you might say, where did this set state come from? Well, it's provided by the base component because it's inherited, because we've just extended the base component, so we can use anything in here in here. But here's another thing we can do. We can also what we call overload methods. So we can also just rewrite one of the methods. So even though we have a render component here, we can rewrite this and console log our own thing. So we'll just do render this component. And we'll just do this dot state. All right, so we're going to let C equals a new counter class. And let's just console log C dot, or we don't need a console log that. Just do C dot render. Oh. All right, render this component. 0, right? Great. Well, let's click a few times. And then render it, and we'll do it one more time. So that counter, and let's do it 3 times. So what should that counter be at the end of this? Those 3 lines? Should be 3, right? And it is. 1, 2, 3. We clicked it 3 times, and it's storing that state inside of this counter. So why did we just go through that? Why does that matter? Well, if we go back here to this vehicles, remember what JC did. You probably didn't realize it, right? As he was going through it, there was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. But what he's actually doing is he's doing this inside of his vehicle. And he's doing this dot set state. Remember, we implemented this dot set state. Where does this dot set state come from? It comes from React.component. Why didn't he do a super and a constructor? Well, it's actually implicit here. He could have easily done a constructor up here called super and said this dot state and move it in there. Make those equivalent. That is equivalent. So now it looks the same as our counter class, right? He does all of this, just happens to be in a component did mount. I didn't do it in my example because I didn't want to overcomplicate it. He also has a render method here. So here's our class. So we just implemented a very simple version of this React.component. It's not quite as simple because it has all of the other stuff, right? The rendering engine, it's got all the virtual DOM and all those kind of magic that happens underneath. It's just code in the end. But really, this is what's happening underneath the hood of this specific component. Now, there's some downsides to using these object-oriented methods, especially in JavaScript. When you start getting into more of the click handlers and things within the browser, you start running into referencing issues and reference issues with how variables are used within the context of the environment. And you start having to do things like binding variables to classes and binding different things together, and it starts to get very verbose. It's actually going to be a lot of work to show you that, so I'm not actually going to do it here. You have to take my word for it. You can investigate it. You can do a little bit more with our vehicle example here, where maybe you can click a button a couple of times and you kind of learn how some of the pitfalls, and they're actually kind of I would say they're subtle, and they introduce bugs and things, and you pull your hair out like, why is that not working? They're very subtle kinds of things. But suffice it to say, the reason the community has really gone away from this class structure and moved to what we call hooks, which I'm going to introduce next, is because of a lot of those challenges. You have the binding, the referencing, the garbage collection, and all the different things that happen within the engines, within the JavaScript engines, that make this a suboptimal way to define how you code. The other thing is that gets really verbose too, right? There's a lot of boilerplate to that. Wouldn't it be much easier just to find one function as a component and be able to manage stuff in there? Well, yeah, right. That would be pretty cool. But we also have this this concept of um, not really being able to keep state within a function, right? Because we have at the very root something called function scope. So now moving away from this, I really wanted just to show you what was going on kind of underneath the hood to some extent of what's happening in React and how that object-oriented kind of inheritance and everything is really not magic. It's just part of the structure in which we code that. But now I'm going to switch over to what we call hooks. And let me do this. Before actually explaining what hooks are, I'm going to transfer this, vehicles, and I'm going to just port it and recode it in a React hook. And then we'll actually do the same exercise that we just did, and I'll implement kind of the underlying and show kind of the underlying hook structure and how that works. Because it's going to look like magic, I promise. It's going to look really weird. All right, so the first thing about hooks is it's a kind of a weird name, but it will become more clear as we go through this example. A hook is just a function. So instead of defining a class like we're doing here, we're going to define a function. So we're going to export, let's just do const vehicle hook is equal to a function. And that vehicle hook is going to replace this entire class here. Just make it a function. All right, so we've got that going for us, and let's just start implementing this. So we've got, let's just go line by line here. So we need to transfer this constructor stuff, specifically this state. There's no concept of constructor now. It's just a function. Functions just run, right? We don't construct things. There's no ability to say what certain lines inside of a function get run once or whatever, right? That would be completely ridiculous to the concept of what a function is, a procedure is. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use something that React gives us called useState. And this is where the magic starts happening. It's going to look so confusing. I really hate hooks. I like programming with hooks. I really hate hooks in the context of pedagogy because it hides so much stuff. It's a very difficult thing to teach. And it promotes bad habits if you don't really understand what's happening. And it's very frustrating for beginners. So that's why I'm not a big fan of it. So I'm going to do some weird things here, what looks like weird things, and hopefully by the end it'll be a little bit more clear after watching this a few times. All right, so what am I doing here? Well, we need to make a new state variable called vehicle list. I'm going to use something called React that's provided by React called useState. I'm going to initialize it to an empty array, and what this useState does is it gives an array back to us. So that's what the return type is. And all I'm doing here is I'm just destructuring, right? Basically, what I just talked about in office hours on Tuesday, just destructuring. And we also need to do the same thing with this vehicle data. So we'll just do vehicle data here. We'll do set vehicle data. So this argument is the state vehicle data. And this is a function that allows us to set the value of this later in our hook. And this is initialized to an empty object, just like that. And we're not going to do the intervals because we're going to use MQTT. So we're not going to need a poll anymore. We're going to let MQTT kind of do the work for us, but we need to do it in hooks first. So I'm going to skip over that. And I'm just going to do this. All right, so we got this component did mount. Well, inside of a class, what does this component did mount do? Well, it runs when the component mounts. So if we want to kind of relate it to our hook here, our function, we want to be able to only run something once the first time it's rendered. So the first time this function is run, we only want this component did mount to run. And so we're going to use something that React gives us called a use effect. And they use this React use effect, which takes as an argument another function. It's our functional language stuff. And inside of here, I'm going to define another function called onComponentMount. So all I'm doing is I'm going to take this thing, this whole thing, just put it in a function inside this use effect. And what React Hooks is going to give us, and it'll be clear later, is the ability to only run this thing once on the first time it gets rendered. I'm just going to copy and paste this. This whole thing here. Is there a try catch or something? No. All right. So on component mount, there's a few things we have to do here to change. First of all, there's some stuff going on here that we don't really need. First of all, this we can make an async function. So we don't really have to deal with these promises, so we can clean this up a little bit. So we can like let JSON data equal this, and then we can await that. And based on this JSON data, we're going to need to set the state, but we need to set vehicle list. So we can go up here and we can get this set vehicle list. And well, we can't do that yet actually, because we're gonna have to map through these things, because there's a reason JC did this way. We have to actually map through all these vehicles. So before setting the vehicle list, we have to map through all of them. Clean that up a little bit. I'm going to create a new variable called vData here. I'm going to initialize it to an empty object, and this is where we're going to put our vehicle UIDs, right? Because we're just building up this object with our vehicle UIDs, and I'm just going to make a for loop. I'm not even going to map it. I'm just going for loop, and I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader here, the viewer, to how to make this more efficient. We actually went over in office hours, probably second week, third week, something when we talk about promises. So I'm going to say let lettuce data equal. So I'm just going down here, this latest data. I'm just going to do this this route here. I'm going to do an await. I'm going to do async await. I'm just going to place that here. And inside here, I need to do vData is equal, or vData of the latest data. Is that? Nope. What I need to do is I need to change this to JSON data of I dot UID. So we need to do that UID there, and then here JSON data of I and dot UID is equal to latest data. So we're just assigning we're just creating an object where the key is the UID of the data, and then I'm just attaching the rest of it to that UID so we can look it up later. All right, so that's good. It's got that for loop. Now we need to set the state here. So now I think we can do set vehicle data equals to vData. And we can also set the vehicle list equal to JSON data. Because this is just the vehicle list, right? And then this vData is just the built up object there. So all of this stuff, which of course was complicated by the set interval here too. So there's a little extra code that we're not really implementing. But you can see, like, we simplified it. Not actually because of hooks at all, because the only thing that really changed was the set state. but because we're using async await here, which we could have done in component did mount. But now we can get rid of that. And we're going to close that brace up here, close that here, and then close that. All right, cool. And then the other thing we have to do is we have to make sure this gets called, because if you look at this, what's happening is this use effect will get called, I promise you that. But all it's going to do is define this function and nothing else. And that doesn't do much for us, right? We just define a function, but we don't run it, so we have to actually run it. You might say, well, why didn't you just implement that? Why did you actually define a function? It actually has to do with how the use effect works. And we're going to see why that is a little bit later. So just take my word for it right now. We'll get there. The other thing we'll do is this use effect takes a second argument, you notice here, called a dependency array. And you can actually make this hook based on this dependency array, the things that are in this dependency array. You can make this hook run multiple times on an update. So we could have maybe added the vehicle list to this dependency array, and so every time that vehicle list changes, meaning every time we do this set vehicle list, this use effect function will run. So we're starting to see now how the hooks are starting to give us a little bit more power to kind of manage when things get run and how they get run. Well, we want this use effect to only run once on the beginning, so no dependencies here. That's it. All right, so we're good there. And let's see, what else do we have to do? Well, we basically just have to return our JSX. So all of everything that's in the render. And it's not a new function, so we don't have to destructure any of that stuff. And basically just copy and paste this thing, right? Yep. There it is. So let's see if that worked. Here's the nice thing. We still have vehicle list. Same thing here. And this vehicle hook, let's export it. So right now it's still exporting that vehicle. Let's export that vehicle hook. And let's see if we have any issues. Hey, look at that. The vehicle hook still works. So we completely changed. So we're now using, so let me close this. Give ourselves some room here. So here's what's cool. So this whole thing is gone now. Our class, which is actually a lot longer. We're exporting our vehicle hook, and now it's just a function. But it does the same thing. Now that's pretty interesting. At least to me. Probably not to you yet. You're probably like, oh, whatever. There's nothing really special happening there, right? I mean, yeah, it's just a function, but it's not like any data changes or anything. Now, if you remember with what JC implemented, you know, with that interval, it would poll every time, and it would get new data and update. And that's when the magic starts happening, right? Like, how does, you know, with that interval, it started setting that state and all that kind of good stuff. Well, before I get into MQTT and all of those different things, let's take a little bit of a break and talk from our example here and start talking about closure and how this magic actually works, this use effect. How does this only run once? And how can I just call another function inside of a function and somehow maintain its state within this scope of this function? All right, so let me go back up here. I'm going to create a new file. I'm just going to call it closure.js. So we have this. So we have this idea. First, let's implement useState. We have this idea of this useState, right? This ability to somehow maintain state within a function. And every time that function gets run, because one thing I haven't probably been extremely clear about here yet is what's happening on this class when we're talking about this vehicle class. Every time a variable updates, this render method gets run again, right? And it updates, right? Those values. That's how we get dynamic web pages. It's the virtual DOM, the virtual document object model that JC explained back in week 3. That's this render function is what's getting called. Well, we don't have a render function anymore in a hook. We just have a whole function. So this whole thing's getting called over and over and over again. And the reason we call them hooks is because we're actually hooking in based on the state. And so the larger React library knows to only rerun this function specifically when one of your variables change, and only return the JSX. But how does this useState actually work? Well, it actually comes down to closure. And the question is, what is closure, right? Or what is, let's start simple. What is function scope, right? What is function scope? Well, let's just take a really simple example. Let x equals 1. We create a function here. We'll call it foo. We can say console log x. What will x be? Anyone know?
1.
It'll be 1, right? So if we, I gotta actually run foo. It'll be 1, right? What if I did this? What will it print now?
2.
It'll print 2. But I thought I already defined x up here.
So overwrites memory and store to there.
Right, because we have a concept of a local scope, right, to the function. We're not actually overwriting x here.
Doing function scoping here?
Yep, function scope. So what will this print out?
Or will be 1.
It'll be 1 again, right? So we have here 1, which you'd expect, and then 2. We'll say we'll inside. So inside and then here, right? And the reason is because we have this concept of scope, function scope. And actually what we have, this is actually closure on its very simplest kind of form. And the way I view closure is basically with these braces. It's not actually accurate, but that's how I think of closure. Because what we're saying is, based on what's going on, we can, anything that's defined outside of the scope of the function at a higher level, at a higher closure, you have available to you within all of the subclosures. Basically braces, right, in JavaScript. And so you have all of this stuff, and then you also have concepts of object references and stuff like that. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but at the very simplest kind of concept, this is really what really the very basic foundation of how of function scope and closure and how React and hooks are actually working. So let's comment that out. If we go back to our example here.
Quickly, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
I may be wrong, but somewhere I read even within the functions,
Mhm.
the way the closure will behave is a little different if you declare a function or if it's a Lambda style function. I mean, I might have confused myself, but I think the closure behavior varies the way you write the function. Is that true?
That is true, actually. So this function here, if we actually change that to foo equals the arrow function,
Mm-hmm.
this actually is not a good example. So you still have function closure, but it actually has to do with how things get bound. So that is actually becomes really critical in your class definitions and why you use arrow functions rather than functions. And you'll start to notice the little idiosyncrasies on that. And that actually was getting into the example that I was kind of avoiding when I was talking about binding scope and those types of things within classes. Because classes are not a first class citizen in JavaScript, functions are. And so you have to do some magic, you have to do some kind of handling, special handling with your syntax in order to manage those types of things. So you are correct, Sonat, but only in certain cases, specifically in defining classes and stuff. In this case, you're going to get the same kind of result, right? But um, in when you're starting to work with classes and you're starting to look at object references and array references and things like that, and how memory is stored, that's when it starts to become really critical. And I don't mean to be putting you off, but we don't have time to go into the depths of that. We can talk about that in office hours a little bit more when we get there. But
Sure.
let me let me start. Let me do this this use state. So I'm going to implement use state here. And this is pretty simple. We've got this use state, and I'm going to just create a variable. I'm going to call it val. And I'm going to set this initial value, val to this initial value. And then inside of there, inside of this use state, I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to call this state. And I'm going to return val. So that's going to give us the state, specifically val, because val is available, right? Because I've defined on a higher closure. And then I've also defined another function called set state. And what the new value is of this, and I'm just going to say val is equal to new val. Oops. There we go. And if we want to somewhat match the API here to set state, because we're really looking at this, we need to return an array with that state and set state in it, because that's all I'm doing here. So we got to return state and set state. Cool. So we've just implemented that set state pretty simply. There's one difference though. If you look at here, this is returning a variable. We're returning a function. And we do that because of actually closure and how you're not actually going to pick up the change in it. Let me make that a little bit more clear. So function, we're going to do a counter hook instead of a counter class this time, right? I'm just now, instead of making a base component, we have nothing to inherit. I've just made set state as a function. So we have this counter here. And I'm going to initialize it to 0. I'm just going to return 2 methods. Really, they're functions, right? And this is where I use the lambda function, this arrow function, so not for that reason, actually, that you brought up. And I'm going to set count equal to count, but it's a function, right? So I have to actually call it in order to get that value out, because I need to bind that scope, that value to that scope, +1. And I need to render it. And just like our other one, our class example, I'm just going to console log rendered count. Now we can do C is equal to counter. And what is that going to return? It's going to return an object with 2 functions. Click and render. So let's click, render. And let's do that 3 times. And run it. Oops, something went wrong. What went wrong? What do we got? Count is not defined. So I meant to make that count, not counter. And then we got an issue here.
It's new value and new val.
Oh. There we go. Rendered 1, 2, and 3. You might say, geez, how did that work? We were basically running this function. Somehow we bound the scope to this function. What we did, and the reason is because we actually made it a val of this val within this function scope, right? And we bound it all within it. And the magic is actually within the context of this count being a function, because we're actually binding scope in memory with this actual count as a function. If we change it to a variable, so now let's say this state is just a variable. That's not going to work, right? Because we're not actually binding anything. We're just running this setting state, and we haven't really done anything there. If anything, we have to change this now, because now it's just a variable. All that's going to do is set it to 0, because we haven't really bound any scope. All we've done is we've set this once and only once. Whereas if we make this an actual function like this, we're actually returning this value and we're actually binding that in memory. I have to change these back to right. All right, so the thing is, somehow, magically, even though we just proved that we just changed that to a variable from a function, and it didn't work, somehow React hooks still provide this magic that allows this to be a variable instead of a function. Because every time we use this vehicle list, like down here, we're not calling a function. We're not returning a value by calling a function. This is just a value, right? It's either an object or an array or something along those lines, something that we set it to be. So how do they do that? Well, as it turns out, the way they do that is by doing another closure on top of it. And we do that by making our own React. So I'm going to comment that out now. And I'm going to create my own React library called myReact. And I'm going to do some crazy stuff there. Oh man, that's a lot of parentheses, isn't it? That's really weird looking. Not really. All I've said here is this is an expression. I'm defining a function there. That's a shorthand in JavaScript to define a function. And then I'm running it. I'm executing it. So I've defined a anonymous function here, and I'm just executing it, right, as a function. And so all I'm saying is, hey, define this function and then return it. I need to do that for scope reasons. And the reason is because I need everything that I'm doing to be included in one function so that we have complete closure, so that we can maintain state within one function the whole time. All right, so inside here, we can say let val, and I'm going to return a basic, a really simple kind of prototype of React. Really simple. Two things. I'm gonna got a render method, and I've got a use state method. And first one, I'll just do render. So render is going to be, let's do this, component. Render component, and got this. I'm going to instantiate the component. Render, I'm going to call the method there, and I'm going to return the component. Don't worry so much about this right now. This is some weird syntax. This is just defining an object like that. All I did was just using some shorthand, cutting it off, and I'm returning an object that's going to return two fields or two keys. One of them render as a function, the other use state as a function. And I'm going to implement use state here. So val is equal to val or initial value. Now what are we doing there? Well, let me finish this real quick and then we'll go through it. And we'll just do val is equal to new val. And we need to return an array of val and set state. All right, so what is going on here? Well, we're basically saying use state of this initial value. So we're just implementing this thing. So initial value could be an object or an array. And we're saying if this val already exists, then use that. If this doesn't exist, then use that. These two vertical bars is an OR. It's a logical OR. And so if the first one evaluates to true, which this val will evaluate to true because it's truthy, because it exists, it will set this val to what it was before. Otherwise, it'll take the initial value of this function. So just a little bit of shorthand there. And then we're just doing this function called set state. And we're going to return that as part of just setting that state and returning that as a value. And just keep in mind, we're keeping this let val in the top of this myReact, right? So we're still within scope. We're still in that closure. That reference is still going to be maintained that entire time. This is what gets loaded at the very top of the document object. And only once at singleton and is run. Okay. So we've got myReact here. So let's implement this counter. In fact, we don't really even have to implement it. Let's do this. And instead of using useState, I'm just going to say myReact.useState. And that's just using this thing right here. And basically that's all I've got to do, right? I don't really have to do anything else other than remove these parentheses. Now let's see how this works. So let app, we're just going to say app is equal to myReact.render. Now this is where this little weird thing happened. Why are we passing this component? Well, what we're saying is within the app, so if we go over here to index.js, you'll see this React DOM.render. This is back in our vehicle render. This React DOM.render, this is what we're doing here with myReact. So we're just saying myReact.render. And what does React.render take? Well, it takes components, specifically an app. In our case, we want it to just take this counter. So we're going to just render counter. And now we can say app.click. And we're going to just say app is equal to myReact.render counter. So we're just going to keep rendering. We're going to click, render, right? And there we go. 0, 1, 2. We can just keep clicking 2. Now you might say, wow, that's like, how is this even connected? That's a really simple example. Well, it doesn't really end up getting much more complicated. Well, it does get complicated, but it's really just tedious work. It's just pattern stuff after that. So instead of doing a console log here, you just take JSX, right? And maybe you want that use effect. Well, you implement the use effect in the exact same way as useState. You just run that effect. And you might say, well, oh, geez, we're only handling one specific variable here. What if we wanted to handle more variables? Like the simple example of what we're doing. See, there's 2 here. How does that work? Because we're really only managing one value here. So our little myReact only handles one state. Well, that's simple. Just make this an array. And then just load up the array with all the different states. So every time this set state is used, or this use state is called, you just add another val to an array. And that value gets held in memory as a reference. It gets passed around. And so it gets a little more complicated, but not so much. It's really just more pattern stuff after this. So there's really no magic happening in here. Really all that's happening is very simply just closure and arrays that are just being managed. And of course the JSX that's being transpiled with Babel and all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of a separate thing to this. It's really just comes down to closure and it comes down to arrays. Now, everything I just said over the last hour, I don't really expect you to get like right now. And there is no way that you get it. I promise. Like, don't feel bad if you're like, what the F did he just talk about? Like, I have no idea. What I want you to do is I want you to review this a little bit more, but I want you to play with React. And what you'll end up doing is you'll run into a few problems all the time with React. And you'll say, wait, I think that's probably a closure problem. Or maybe I don't understand this as well. Come back to this video and kind of watch what I just did with that. And as you get more comfortable with JavaScript, as you get more comfortable with closure, as you get more comfortable with functional programming and front end stuff, it'll start making more and more sense. And just keep kind of reviewing it, keep thinking about it. So don't worry if you were like, man, what just went on? That's really more of an exposure thing, because that's what's important. And to know that it's not magic happening, and it really doesn't take a ton to understand it. It's really just doing it a few times, hitting some of those walls, and really understanding, hey, yeah, there's something else going on here, and just really being exposed to it. The thing that you probably can see why this is so frustrating from a beginner's perspective, right? And we haven't even gotten to the tough part with like context and Redux and everything yet. The reason this is so frustrating is because it looks like magic. Like it breaks down even the basic understandings of how function scope is supposed to work, right? I mean, it really does. It just doesn't look natural, and it isn't natural. And that's why it's so frustrating for a beginner, because while a beginner can just use a pattern, if they take it to the one little simple thing like implementing MQTT, which we're going to do next, it all falls apart if you don't actually truly understand how this stuff is working underneath the hood and why closure is so critical and how references are kept and all of that kind of good stuff. So what's next? Well, there's really nothing spectacular about this thing, right? There's nothing going on with it. How do we make something go on? Well, we do it with MQTT. And Justin showed all of that stuff. What was it, last week? Did you guys do MQTT last week or the week before? Last week?
That was last week.
Cool. So now, unfortunately, we got to figure out why this thing's not working. It's MQTT broker. So before we do that, let's do some debugging here. Figure out what JC effed up, because I'm not taking responsibility for this. It's in the authentication. All right. Let's open this thing up. And here's what I'm thinking about doing. I am going to go here and I'm going to go to index here, and I know it's happening inside of the authentication. So I am going to pull that out. I'm going to make it simple. And I'm just going to start it and be good to go. So why is it, there's things connecting, probably because I have something else going on here. All right, so what we've got here is MQTT broker. The only thing I've done here is I've commented out the authorization. Remember last week we spent a lot of time going over authorization, right? How to, check passwords, how to check tokens, how to go through that flow and that format. I just said, let's not worry about this right now because that's not the key. What I want you guys to do for homework, so you have like a second homework assignment now, is go back and implement that after we implement this stuff with the front end. Okay, this is the easy part, I promise. Okay, so now we've got this should be working. We're good there. Let's open up vehicles. All right, so on the front end, we're going to need to install MQTT because we're going to use a library. If we go here, MQTT, npm, gives us a nice library that allows us just to make a client. Actually made by the same guy who did 80s, and so they work pretty well together. So we basically just need to yarn add MQTT. Now, as it turns out, which I ran into this week, the latest version of this library MQTT, version 4, is broken. And it's broken as of 4 days ago. And so after much hair pulling and figuring out why is this not actually working, and why is all my other stuff still working that's in production, I figured that out, and we're going to install an older version of the library. So we can do that by simply targeting a version, a revision code, version 3, and what that will do is that will insert this little @3 will insert into our package.json a dependency. Where are we at here? Am I in the wrong package? It's probably not done yet. When it's done, it will write it in, and it will write it in as version 3. Whereas if you notice here, all these versions are saying, look, this caret right here just says, hey, install this or whatever the newest version is. The way I just installed that is it will only ever install version 3. It'll fix it on version 3. So whenever they get their crap figured out, we'll be able to upgrade to 4. Okay. So once we do that, once this installs and everything, we can import that. So we're going to import MQTT from MQTT. So that's good. And what we can do is what we need. So there's a few things we need to do, right? First of all, we need to connect to the broker. So we need to do like an mqtt.connect. And then we need to subscribe to the topics, specifically each of the topics where the data is coming in. If you remember from last week, the broker is one thing. It's basically just sitting up there, it's a server. And then what's happening is when data is coming in, it's being published to a specific topic. And that topic looks like a route, just an HTTP route, but it's an MQTT broker topic. And it has its vehicle / the vehicle UID / data, right? And so we're going to have to subscribe individually to each one of those in order to render every time new data comes in. To render that new information within our page. And what we want to do is we want to update this latest data, this vehicle speed, and this last report time. Okay. So what we need to do though is now that we have a hook, there's a few things we have to do. First of all, we can't do, we can connect, but we can't actually connect into MQTT inside of this use effect. And the reason is because MQTT needs a persistent socket, right? So if every time, what happens is every time this runs and this use effect gets loaded, it's going to reassign that socket, and we're going to lose the old socket. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause a lot of thrashing on the MQTT broker. Not to mention you're going to lose some stuff too, probably, because you're constantly, every time you're rendering, you're just reconnecting that socket over and over and over. And so what we can do is one of the nice things about this is we kind of get these hooks for free, so we can create our own hook, remember, because we just did with that set state. And a simple example, why don't we just create a use MQTT that runs once? It's not going to be too bad, so let's do that. So let's do a const use MQTT. This is going to equal to a function, regular function, and let's say this function takes a few things: the URL of the broker, the options for it, so maybe the client stuff, client information, and then it's going to take a couple of functions. And these functions are event handlers. Specifically, we basically have 3 things that we want to do that are going to happen once the MQTT does its thing. First thing is we want to be able to maybe run a function when the client connects. So when there's a successful connect, we want maybe to define a function to print something like, hey, you connected, or just give us some debugging information. The second one is we want an on error event. So if there's an error, we want to be able to handle that, maybe for debugging, or maybe display a little toast message or something on the page that says, hey, there's a problem connecting to the broker. The third, which is the most important, is we want to handle interrupt style messaging. So unlike what JC did last week with his interval, that's a very deterministic thing, right? We're just asking every time, we get an answer back, we can time that very appropriately. In the case of MQTT, we have no way to time that, right? It's totally asynchronous. We have no idea when vehicles are going to post their data. We just have to be ready to accept it at any point, and we got to fire an event and do something with that data. when it comes in, but we have no clue. We have no ability as a front end to be able to dictate when that's going to happen. So inside of here, we got a couple of different. So we have an on message event handler. By default, we'll just do an empty function, empty arrow function. We've got an on error. Once again, just an empty function, and then we'll do an on connect. Now, why am I not making those camel cases? Because I'm just basically following the little the MQTT spec for this library. Why is that not liking that thing? Who sees a possible problem with that? Anybody? I don't really see a... Huh. What am I doing there? What am I doing wrong there?
I think you need to put parentheses around the curly brackets since it's doing an immediate return. So
oh, that's
parentheses around, it's parentheses, yeah.
Nope.
Are those square brackets?
No, I mean that's an arrow function.
No, but were those square brackets around that, or were they parentheses?
Parentheses. Oh, I know why. Because I'm being stupid. The reason is I'm not defining functions. If I wanted to make these by default, I should have put an equal sign. Because this is actually function parameters. It's an object that I'm destructuring as function parameters to this function. And this is just a default argument. All right. So, and then what we can also do is, in order to make sure that we follow the hook kind of paradigm and standard, we're going to add a dependencies array, just like this use effect. So we're basically just implementing another version of this use effect here, with this dependency array. So let's do this. We'll do a let client equal react dot. There's something called use ref. Now remember, I mentioned before that we don't want to lose the reference, right? That socket, which is a reference in memory. We don't want to lose that. And so React gives us a nice thing called use ref, which allows us to basically stake a claim to a reference, an area in memory that will never change. And we're going to use that, and we're going to attach the client, basically the MQTT client, that socket, to this reference, so that it never gets cleaned up, it never gets touched. It's always the same one every time. And inside of this hook, we're going to do our use effect. So we're going to do react.use effect, because this is really all this is just a hook. And what we've got here is client.current. Now what's that .current? Well, as it turns out, that .current is part of the useRef spec API. And the way it does, and that's how it actually makes that reference, is it's actually an object. And there's a difference in JavaScript on how objects are handled as opposed to primitives. Primitives being ints, floats, single values. Primitives get cleaned up. They get copied all over the place. They don't really have any special place in memory. Whereas objects and arrays do. They are actually references in memory. They get a special spot, and then you can pass them around, but they get passed around by reference. as opposed to value. Primitives are passed by value. Arrays and objects are passed by reference. What we need is a reference, right? And so we're going to use an object, and as part of the API that React provides, there's a client.current. And so this .current is just a key on this object, useRef. So we're going to do an mqtt.connect. So we're just using this library here up here. And we're going to pass the URL that we're passing in and any options. So this might be authentication, stuff like that. We're just using the MQTT API. And now we're doing on. And what this MQTT.connect does is it returns an MQTT object. And that object is basically that socket, that MQTT connection. And it provides a function called .on, which allows you to attach event handlers. And this is that interrupt thing that we talked about earlier, that on connect, and particularly that on message. So when we're saying on message, we want to run a function. What function do we want to run? We want to run our on message. We want to do that for others too. On air and on connect. There we go. So we're attaching that. This actually isn't going to work because we're actually losing the reference because of closure. So what we actually have to do is we have to wrap that in a function itself. And what we've got here now is we need to return a function called onMessage. And we have to do topic. We're going to pass topic to it. We're doing pass a payload .toString. Just turning that into a string. And we'll do the same thing with this onConnect. So with this onConnect, we pass the client. So we'll just return onConnect client.current. Okay, and since this is a use effect, the reason we passed this dependency array in was so that we can make sure we spell it right. And so we can make sure that we get these dependencies. So what we're doing is we're watching variables. And so every time something changes, we may want to reload. Like if an error happens, we may want to reconnect or something along those lines. So we want this to run again, but we want control over that inside of our hook. Okay, so we've now implemented our use MQTT hook, and we can use it inside of our vehicle hook here. And if you've noticed, we made this really general. It has nothing to do with our vehicle stuff, has nothing to do, this is part of this architecture we're abstracting. In fact, if you wanted to get real tricky, you could actually put this on NPM and say, hey, here's a use MQTT hook, just download it, right? Pretty abstract, works real well. Well, we haven't really proved that yet, but I think it works pretty well. We'll see. All right, so let's use MQTT here. And we just need to start doing some stuff. So this is where we get concrete, right? This is where we're actually connecting. This is where our vehicle stuff happens. We need to connect to our broker, all that kind of good stuff. So our URL is part of our API. So we have this API up here, and one of the things, so if we go to our API here, you'll notice that we have this API base URL, but we need to connect. Let's just do a WS API base URL. And what is that? Well, it's WS, because we're connecting to MQTT over WebSockets, right? It's not HTTP. It's where we're constant communication. So totally different than an HTTP. It's WebSockets, and so we need to change that. But here's the other thing: that 9500 isn't right either, right? Because we've exposed on our broker here, we've exposed 1885 and 1886. We've exposed 1885 for MQTT, if you remember. We exposed 1886 for WebSockets. They carry the same information. It's just our library's given us a couple different options. Why can't we use MQTT in the browser? Because the browser actually doesn't support the net sockets, the network layer that's required to actually emulate the MQTT. And so we have to use WebSocket instead, which is emulating the MQTT basis. So we need to change this to what port? 1886. And I'm going to export this so that I can grab it from this API. So I can say api.ws API base URL. So that's what I want to connect to. I also want to, my options here, I can maybe do a client ID. Let's do a client ID of, I don't know, client dash, and then we'll do like a new date. Let's do get time, which is going to give us a millisecond Unix string, and we'll just do like a .toString because we need to make a unique client name, client ID, right, for the broker. I don't really care what it is. I just need to make sure it's unique. So I'm just going to get my time and it's not random, but it's going to give us what are the chances of, that on a small scale, probably pretty low that they would be connecting at the exact same millisecond time. So that's what we'll do there. You can also shove your username or password in, or token, right, which JC will do next week with context, because we need to do a bunch of different stuff. These hooks are going to get really important when we start doing9context, and you'll see why next week. And then we need to define onMessage. And we'll make this an async function so we can use async await in it. And if you remember, this onMessage up here is just going to call our current onMess, but we're going to just return this. So we basically just need to execute this, but we're going to return a function here so that we don't actually run it first. We just define the function to do it, and then we're going to say let data equals json.parse the payload, which is coming in as a string because we already did a toString here. Remember, just calling this function that we're passing in. So we're parsing that because MQTT doesn't assume anything, right? It's not assuming you're passing JSON or anything. We're just passing a string. We've just chosen to pass JSON as our protocol over it. We could have passed natural text, right? Natural language text. We could have whatever. And so we've just agreed between the front and the back end, that contract, that we're going to be passing JSON. So we'll parse that. And then we can use our set vehicle data hook use state to what the previous state was. So instead of just passing a direct value in, which will cause a lot of problems because of the fact that these set states are asynchronous. They're not synchronous. So if you have a lot of events firing all the time, that's going to be a big problem. You're going to get concurrency issues and all this kind of stuff. So instead, what you need to do is, instead of setting it to a value directly, a primitive or just an object even, what we need to do is take the previous state, meaning that previous object of, where was it? This vehicle data, and kind of scope it for modifying it. So take this previous state. So we will we'll return previous state with the new data dot vehicle UID, data. There's a little bit of JavaScript stuff right there, right? We've got spread operator previous state. So take everything from the previous state, and if you think about what this object is, it's basically an object of a bunch of UIDs with the latest data, right? And so what we're saying is take all of the previous stuff, because we don't care about that, and overwrite it with the current vehicle UID that's coming in from the MQTT broker, which is only one vehicle, and just assign the data to it. So we've got that, and we're good to go. And then let's do an on connect. We'll pass, so we'll do that client here, and the reason we get to do that client is because we're passing in this on connect the client.current. The reason we want the client is because we need to first, once we connect, right, we want to console log one that we've connected to MQTT, which is a good just debugging thing. But what do we need to do after we connect? We need to subscribe to all those topics. So that's what we're going to do here, but we need the client reference in order to do that. So that's why we're being provided the client here, and we can say this vehicle list, which we will have already gotten. We'll assume we've already gotten V. We're going to map through all of them, and we're going to do client.subscribe, because it's just MQTT now. The vehicle to the topic, vehicle v.uid / data. And this use MQTT, we need to pass dependencies, right? What dependencies do we pass? The dependency we have to pass is the vehicle list. Why? Because it's possible that MQTT will connect before this gets returned. We don't control what order this use effect happens. So it's possible that this MQTT will connect and get an empty vehicle list array, basically what we initialized it to. Because we may be waiting on this to come back from the server. So we need to update it, and we need to make sure that MQTT gets rerun and reconnects once it gets that vehicle list update. And so we're going to put that as a dependency here, so that every time that vehicle list changes, make sure to update that topic subscription. All right. So we got that. As it turns out, I think we are. I think we're good to go. We've implemented our MQTT. We've taken care of the data here. We've set the vehicle data when it comes in, and we've subscribed all the topics on an on connect. So what's next, guys? What do we got to do? We need to run that emulator, right? We got to test this thing. Right now, nothing's happening because no vehicles are running. So we need to run this. Need to run the emulator. So in order to do this, let me pull in another window, which is on my local machine here. And I am going to, this is just the same thing. I'm going to run my embedded. So I've already got this kind of set up here. I'm just going to run, this is just in my embedded folder. Just going to run sumo. Never mind. I lied. All right. There you go, Beth Ann. It's the same thing that you were asking me about. Do I have to set that environment variable time? Yep, you do.
I always forget it.
Go. That's running. That's coming in. Oh, but that's not it's not doing its thing. I wonder why. All right, time for debugging. So, the one thing that we probably expect in a big way, right, is for this MQTT broker to log the connections, right? So every time every time this the front end connects, we should see this thing, you know, the broker respond, hey, someone connected to me and subscribed with the client ID, specifically this client ID. So let's open up our dev tools here, go to our console. We should see that's fine. Let's see here. There we go. Now we're starting to get something different. All right, so it's not liking something about this listener stuff. I wonder what the problem is. Okay. So the thing that I noticed was going wrong, if we look at this, is how these functions are created. So I basically just made sure that we provided default functions for each one. Now you notice this thing's going crazy. Why is that thing going crazy? Well, it has to do with our rendering of our hooks. So somewhere we have a little bug in how we're doing this. And so it looks like we need to make sure I actually did something wrong here. Remember how I mentioned this vehicle list here? And this use effect that we need to watch it? That was the wrong place to put that thing. Why? Because it's changing itself, right? And it's making it dependent upon itself. Because we're actually, this use effect is responsible for changing this specific vehicle list. But we're depending on this. So it's just caught itself in a big old loop because it's changing itself, then re-rendering, changing itself, re-rendering. So what I needed to do was take that off. I needed to put it right there in the MQTT. Because it's the MQTT I need to depend on that vehicle list, not the component did mount, basically. We noticed it worked a lot nicer. Here's the other thing. Good stuff. We actually have this. So every time, so I reload it, the MQTT broker looks like it's getting these, it's noting that, hey, I got some connections, I got my clients to connect. How many clients I've got connected? Well, I got one client connected, but I've got a bunch of subscriptions. Why do we have a bunch of subscriptions? Because you got a bunch of vehicles. We've got 9 vehicles, right? For each one of these vehicles, we've got whole thing. So we've got that. Ooh, it's got a Galaxy Fold now. That's cool. Here's the other thing. You can in these dev tools, you can pick different phone sizes, so you can kind of test your sizes and your responsiveness. I was gonna see if there was something a little bit bigger, but it's okay. All right, so we've got this. The other thing is we look at our console. You see that we've connected to MQTT right here. So we just ran this connected MQTT. So our event handler is working. So that's good. If we refresh this page, got a refresh there, that's good. And now, if we run our sumo again, well, we're still not seeing much. Nope. We're not seeing much activity here on here, so we have to debug a little bit more here. So let's do a on message. Let's console log this. So on every message, we want to console log the we're not getting it. So for whatever reason, we're not actually getting this. We're connecting.
I think it may be the name of the topic there on line 50.
I think so.
Yeah, it shouldn't be vehicles.
Oh, good catch. That could have wasted a bunch of time. Really good catch. So on line 50, should be vehicles, not vehicle. There we go. Oh, sweet. We got it. Let's start our sumo over. There it is. Look at that. Real time. No refreshing the page. It's the simple things in life, guys. That was just awesome. Each one getting their own data, their own color as they go here.
Look at that kind of race.
I know, right? You just keep. Have any of you gotten like 100 vehicles on your networks yet? How cool is that? To me, that's like one of the coolest things. It's so simple, right? Like what we just did. There are but so many layers, right? This is not actually simple. What we do, even at a simple example, is not actually simple, but it's beautiful, right? I mean, to now understand, I'm sure you guys, at least, having made it this far, at least see the complexity of what's going on behind here, and to think that a normal user kind of takes for granted a web page that updates in front of them, and probably a mere 7 weeks ago you probably took it for granted, but that is what goes on. So we've just connected the full circle here for real-time data using REST, using MQTT with the front end, with some styling and system design and neuromorphism in the cards, all that kind of stuff. And we're able to get some vehicle speed to update in real time on our card. But from here, as you can probably tell, it's just patterns now, right? There's a few things we haven't really covered. We'll do that next week, where we talk about form management and things. JC, you were talking about using Formic. I would use Formic when you make that login screen, because that's a little form. So now there's the how do we secure this? How do we make a little login and manage that, and then manage a flow through this where maybe multiple components need to depend on changing data like this. Because if you think about it, we've just done, and all of this stuff, we're just using state. Where'd my use state go? This use state is only for vehicle hook. But what happens if your nav bar, which is a totally different component, what if your nav bar also needed the vehicle speed for some reason? Like maybe it was keeping track of the race, who was going fastest. Well, you need to share that, but you can't really share states between components. That's a big no-no. You can't. You shouldn't. So you have to use context and all the different stuff that goes with it. And that's what we're going to do next week. So we're taking it to the next level with that. But still, I still get excited when I see how cool is that? It's that little vehicle speed going.
Have we discussed props at all?
Not really. That's going to be something that we're going to do with I think with context.
Yeah, I think one of the things that'll be good is shoving down into like an actual vehicle card component things into props, because you can technically try to pass everything via props, but it turns into a mess. So yeah, next week we'll get into the details of why context is nice.
Yep. Yeah, and like I said, the one thing we really haven't done is like editing things. So like, let's say there's a button here at the bottom where you can get more details about the vehicle. That's when you start nesting components and all this kind of good stuff. But we'll get into that next week. So that's it's basically what I had today. And front end, as you can probably tell, is a hell of a lot more complex than back end. It actually is. We kind of do it to ourselves in some ways, with all the technology that's kind of built up and the complexity of the browser and all this kind of stuff. But in the end, it kind of falls out, and it's very elegant in how we kind of handle it. But it does take some understanding to kind of get over that initial hump of why are we doing all this crap? Why don't we just manipulate the DOM? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. We've kind of gone over those in the last number of weeks. Cool. So any questions? Or have you all been hit by a Mack truck at this point and you're like, holy crap, I need to review this before I even can intelligently ask a question?
Yeah, there's a bunch of processing that needs to happen.
I bet. Now let me ask the one guy, so not JC, of course, because he does this for a living. How about Clayton? So Clayton, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Okay. You've done pretty much all this stuff. You haven't done React and stuff, but you've done, you've made web pages and in the old styles and those kind of things. in terms of manipulating the DOM directly and the server and decoupling front end and back end, do you see the power and the difference between the way this is done and how traditionally it was done back even 5 years ago?
Oh yeah. I mean, just a few years ago, I mean, even I have applications that are still written that way, where, you're producing HTML, you're producing CSS, using your scripts, and you're writing the stuff out. And it's a nightmare to change anything because you have to go all the way back through the scripts and that sort of thing. So yeah, this model is way better, I
And
think.
I'll
I mean, it's
echo.
like, using, this, just learning fast API and setting up the routes. It just makes it so much easier to maintain because you can just go in, find that route, do a few changes there, what's in and out, and it just makes it simple.
Yeah. And I'll echo Clayton's statement that he still has things that are running the kind of in the old way where you couple everything together. I'll be honest, I do too.
Yeah.
And this stuff's not actually that old, just a few years. And so, and it in a couple more years, it'll all be obsolete too. So,
Yeah, I mean, just a few years ago, you had to write APIs by yourself. I mean, you just cranked the code out. You had to get down in the minutia of the specification and code it by hand to get what you want. But these new tools are just fantastic.
specifically the HTTP, I think what you're saying, right, is like you had to literally write out the HTTP protocol,
Oh yeah.
send that.
Well, I mean, even you had to know for an API. If you're going to do a RESTful API, you got to know what calls or do what things are supposed to happen. So you can't just say, hey, this is going to be a get and leave it at that and let it write out its documentation and all that sort of thing. So
Right.
it's just a way better model for maintenance. For me, that's what I think.
Yeah. And I'll make kind of a general statement here for those of you who probably won't go and become software engineers. Instead, you'll be managing people who are doing this. Oftentimes, you'll run into engineers and even web developers and stuff who will continue to try to do things in the style that Clayton was saying because they know it, they're used to it. And as a manager, uh, maybe before this, you may not have realized that, yeah, there are better ways and better ways to push your teams to adopt these new tools because in the long run, while it may be painful for the team to pick up these new tools and learn things quickly, it is going to save you so much time and money in the long run, specifically what Clayton said in maintenance and being able to cross teams and bring it to the next team and everything. So just I mean even if you never code again or do any of this stuff from an implementation perspective, after this, um, just know that when you're managing these teams, that there are better ways than what the majority are going to come to you and propose. Specifically, hey, let's rewrite an entire REST API stack and then get to our application. Don't let them do that. Say, have you guys considered REST Express? Have you guys considered Fast API, which we'll get into? Have you guys considered React? Things like that.
It's really tough. I mean, when I first started working for BJ, that I've been doing stuff. It's like he wants me to use the code.
VS Code.
Yeah, he wants, and I understand that, and you just sometimes you have to be forced to do something and try something new because I've been using the IDE that I use. I've been using it for more than 20 years. The same, idle since Python 1.52. It's just a natural thing for me to do. And it doesn't mean that it's better. And it's the same thing with APIs. I mean, RESTful APIs. I've been writing, I've got my own code and all that stuff set up. But it's so much easier to maintain these libraries that have been really well developed and well thought out. And so sometimes you just have to push the old guys to just to take the time to learn the library, because nobody, that's hard to do.
Yeah.
Learn new libraries.
It really is, particularly when you've been doing stuff for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't keep working on this, if you don't keep coding and stuff like that, how quickly do you get out of date? And how do you keep, as a manager, how do you keep up to date on, if you're not actually doing the coding, how do you keep up to date on the tools and make sure that that you aren't out of date?
That's what separates an incredible architect from a bad architect.
And another thing too is tools. People will come up with a new tool every Friday.
Yep.
Okay. And so you've got to let those tools mature a little bit and really look at them and make sure that they're good for what you're doing. So, I mean, I'm in love with Fast API, which is, a Python API library, and it's great. And, but there's a new tool every day, and you don't want to adopt every new tool just to be up to date.
Right. Well, and that leads into basically, what I was going to say between an architect and a bad one. A new architect is a good architect is constantly coding. Just constantly coding. They're I am constantly pulling down new libraries, evaluating them, looking at them, saying, can we do this better? Getting in, actually coding some of the libraries, providing my team members with code snippets and examples of the way I think something should be done, and that's the way I stay up to date. I may not be deploying an entire system. Sometimes I have to, but I've worked with architects before in large organizations, specifically in Chicago. There's an organization there, and there was an architect that was put on this team, and all their responsibility was due to front end. And I asked him going into the project, because we were kind of peers at that point. When was the last time you coded? Expecting him to say, "Oh, like yesterday." He said, "I haven't coded probably in about 25 years." I said, "How the hell?" Or I'd say this to the guy. I just like, "Okay, cool, thanks. Looking forward to working with you." But in my head, of course, what I was thinking is, how the hell are you architecting code in a React that has literally only been around for 3.5 years? This might have been a couple years ago. It's only been around 3 years, and you've not coded in 25? How are you supposed to even communicate with your team? How are you even supposed to do a code review? Like, what are you architecting? Right? Because it goes beyond just putting systems together. Like, you have to know what tools are feeding in and how these things are working together. Well, the guy got canned probably 6 months into the project because, obviously he had no business being there. But that's the thing. There are so many architects, and I run into them everywhere. Architects that haven't coded in 10 years because you graduate away from that. You should never graduate away from code. You always have to be evaluating. It doesn't mean you have to be a great coder. It just means that you know enough to get in, prototype something, and understand, hey, yeah, we need to do it this way. Or understand enough to say, all right, team, I want you to go investigate this path because I think there's something there, right? That's the mark of a good architect. And so, yeah, Beth Ann, to answer your first question, and that is, how long does it take to become obsolete? I would say legitimately to become truly obsolete, the joke, of course, is like a day, right? Because you forget to code, right? And then probably a day or two if you don't do it. The real answer, though, I would say is about 1.5 years, probably, because that's how fast this stuff moves. To Clayton's point, there's a new tool every Friday. It takes about 1 year for a tool to mature enough and gain enough popularity to start making an impact, and to shift thinking. So I would say probably about 1.5 years to become truly obsolete if you don't code. And when I say don't code, it take a couple hours, right? Like even if you're not, now that you guys have done this and are, take a couple hours a week and just sit down and bang something out,
So I remember in one of the early videos, and I think it might have been Andy, but I'm not sure, talked about, he actually referenced a site that he goes to that have little coding challenges. And he said that was a really good way of doing something, that just to kind of challenge himself, that he would go and do that. And I actually thought, oh, gee, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought seriously about doing it. But I remember him saying, or someone along the way in the videos you recommended, saying,
Like yeah,
if you don't
like
necessarily have a
It was
project.
Code Wars.
Code Wars,
that-
yeah.
Yeah.
Doing some of those.
Yeah.
Those are fun.
That.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Are they worth doing?
Oh yeah, yeah. Get
Oh,
Oh
okay.
yeah, they definitely get you thinking, and then actually seeing a lot of the results that people
Okay.
submit, you kind of go, oh, you could have done it this way, could have done it that. You just kind of
Okay.
makes you realize that coding is more artistic in some ways than scientific.
It is truly an art, because there's a billion different ways to do the same problem, right ways too.
One of the things though about Code Wars, I don't know if you guys got this feeling, but a lot of the kind of questions that they ask in Code Wars are like algorithm style questions. And so, and those, I don't know, to me, developing a system and building a system and then solving algorithmic problems are the differences between, you know, writing an article and writing poetry, you know? And so you're exercising a similar muscle, but it's not a one-on-one kind of comparison. I mean, it's like some of those algorithm problems are incredibly difficult, to be honest. And you almost have to kind of, they're a thing in their own right.
Yeah. Oh, it's like a puzzle book, right? It's almost like doing a puzzle for the sake of the puzzle. And that's the way those problems are. You do exercise the same muscle, so yeah, don't expect that you're getting any kind of, you know, system think or something you'll actually be able to use, you know, in the real world. But you do get, you know, exercise your thinking, your logic skills, and your language skills too, which I think is what Code Wars really provides, is kind of a platform and an ability to kind of explore different ways to do things with the language.
So what would you recommend then to kind of, if you want to keep doing it, if you want to keep working on building your skills, and you said, well, you need to keep coding, how do you find those projects and those activities to kind of force yourself to keep coding and challenging yourself? I mean, it's easy to say, okay, well, I'm going to come up with a project and develop this all myself, but is there guidance that you have? And maybe you can just talk about this in office hours, that kind of give us some suggestions as to how do we continue to improve.
Yeah, let's definitely make sure to ask this during office hours again, because we'll do it. But I will say a couple different ways. One is picking a project and doing it, something you're passionate about. Perfect way, right? No brainer. That's how we all started, right? The second way, of course, is put yourself into a position in your job where maybe you don't necessarily expected to code, but you know, coding makes life easier in many ways, right? I mean, I'm sure you can all imagine in your job how many mundane tasks you do on a daily basis, where it's kind of like, hey, I'm just going to write this code to, like, you know, automate this whole spreadsheet thing. That's a perfectly valid thing to do. You know, exercise yourself. Doesn't matter if you're writing VB or JavaScript or MQTT. Yeah, maybe you don't do it, but you're at least exploring different tools and things, and kind of keeping on top of specific things. There's no way to keep on top of everything. I mean, there's just no way. There's way too much stuff. But as long as you stay on top of the things that you're interested in and all that kind of stuff, you're still exercising that strategy and keeping somewhat relevant, because you will be exposed to all the different ways and the tools and all that kind of stuff. And you're now armed with at least knowledge of what there is to know, the basis. So now you know what to look for within the context of whatever problem you're trying to solve. And it may be a VB macro in Excel, whatever. I'm sure you have better ways now to attack that.
You know, I think one thing for young or new programmers is it can be discouraging, because, you know, you come up with an idea and then you go and look and you say, oh, well, somebody else has already done it and that sort of thing. Don't worry about it. Just do it, you know, and it may not be right. It may not be perfect, but go ahead and do it and learn, and then look at what someone else has done and see whether they did it, see whether they really did it better. Maybe they didn't. Yeah, you might have been more efficient, you know.
It's actually a good thing. Don't pick as your first problem something no one's ever done before, because there's nothing to compare against, right? So yeah. Yeah, definitely. But ask that question again. I'll think about it a little bit over the weekend and come up with some different ways. But yeah, let's have a conversation about that on Tuesday. Any other questions?
People like us have zero coding knowledge. How can be without any coding deeper knowledge like you guys? How can be a good architect?
That's exactly. Exactly. You need some. You don't have to be an extremely adept coder to be a good architect, but you do need at least some ability to code, right? And you need some experience to know the very best of the best architects are extremely proficient coders. And what that provides you is an ability to look 3 or 4 or 5 steps ahead and know the pitfalls that the developers are going to hit before the developers even realize that they're going to hit it, right? Because you know, all right, I know how I would code that, and I know that there's a pitfall here, and you can make better decisions and lead your team better that way. Oftentimes, also, the way teams are structured, and this is really unfortunate, the way big software development teams are typically structured is an architect actually has no power within the team. They have no managerial power. They basically act as a consultant. There's someone the team can go to and ask advice or provide, and basically the architect is deliverables are expected like spec documents and things like that, but that's about it. My belief is that an architect basically needs to be the end all be all. They need to be the boss. And yeah, you're sharing roles and responsibilities there, and that's tough on a number of different MBA levels, right? But that's a really effective architect and a team structure is if you have an architect who can both lead and knows architecture. That's a really good combo. And so often I see, you have a technical director who's not coded in maybe 50 years, not just 20, but like 50 years. You have an architecture team or an architect who's just there as a consultant, and then you have a project manager, right, who's over here, and then you have a lot of developers and DevOps and everyone else. And no one actually ever has any kind of authority to say anything other than the technical director, who really doesn't know his ass from a hole in the ground. And so the architect, all they can do is kind of sit over there and be like, well, I think you should do this. But in the end, it's the technical director's call. So, and the technical director has no clue, right? So whether he trusts his architect or not, probably not, because the architect's probably like, that's dumb. That's not going to work, right? So you really need to move an architect into a managerial role. And that architect needs to be able to both manage as well as architect and take the responsibility. And that's going to be a really effective team. So that's and to do that, they have to be able to code, right? To bring it around to your question, because they need to be able to manage that team and know where the pitfalls are and where to kind of guide them as they go. There's none of the shared responsibility crap, because the buck has to stop somewhere, and it's not going to stop on someone who doesn't know what the f they're doing, right? So
it is only for us to start from software testing, just slowly gain the experience of coding. Then at some point you can.
Yes, QA is usually an entry point, and typically that's where we'll start like weaker software or weaker coders or newer coders. We'll start them in QA because you can kind of gain some more coding skills. The only way to really learn how to code is to throw yourself in. Just beat yourself up. And yeah, it'll take you a little bit longer. Make sure your team understands it will. But that's the only way. It's like learning a new freaking language, right? Actual spoken language. You just got to immerse yourself. Send yourself to that country. Don't let yourself make sure you don't speak your own language and just get by. That's the only way to do it. It's the same way here.
That's good.
Cool. All right. Well, we're 6 minutes over. Well, I don't know. Kind of. Whatever the time is, we stop. Generally, we try to stop at midnight. So.
Good. Okay. See you on Tuesday.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Guys.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thank
guys.
you. Good night.